The city of Rome sleeps beneath a thin veil of dawn. Soft light touches rooftops of tile and marble, and the streets below, narrow, uneven, and ancient, wait for footsteps that have not yet begun. A single breeze drifts down from the Esquiline hill, carrying the faint scent of olive oil and dust, of hearth smoke and history. It is a city between storms. The great dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla is dead. His statues still stand in the Forum, but his reforms, his vision of a frozen republic where the Senate ruled unchallenged, are already beginning to unravel. The executions, the proscriptions, the years of blood and fear have left Rome quieter, but not calmer. It is the kind of peace that comes only when no one dares to speak. And as this quiet settles over the city, I want to welcome you. Whether you're here to drift off into dreams, or letting this play softly in the background while you do something else, I'm glad you're here. Before we drift into history, tell me in the comments, what's one place in the world you'd love to see in person? Now let's return to ancient Rome, to a time when the Republic stood proud yet hollow, pretending that order had been restored. The year is 78 BC. In the Subura district, a maze of crowded tenements and fading villas, a young man wakes to that same Roman dawn. He is Gaius Julius Caesar, about 22 years old, sharp-eyed, quiet, and already aware that the world is not as stable as it pretends to be. Sulla had ruled Rome like a surgeon performing an operation on the state. He cut deeply, and many bled, but he claimed to have saved the patient. Now that he was gone, the Republic lived on, stitched together, scarred, and forever changed. The Senate was swollen with his supporters, men elevated not by merit but by loyalty. Many of them owed their fortunes to the confiscated property of the proscribed, those citizens whose names had appeared on Sulla's lists of death. Their widows and children still walked the streets, their faces pale at the sight of old enemies living in their stolen homes. Caesar's own family was tied to that history. His aunt, Julia, had been married to Gaius Marius, Sulla's greatest rival, a man once hailed as the savior of Rome, now reviled as a traitor in the official record. By blood, Caesar belonged to that forbidden name. By choice, he refused to deny it. When Sulla's agents came demanding loyalty oaths, Caesar refused to divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, another of Sulla's enemies. For that act alone, the dictator ordered his property seized and his life threatened. Only through the pleading of family friends, including the Vestal Virgins themselves, was he spared. But he understood the message. Rome rewarded obedience, not conscience. So Caesar left. He slipped quietly out of the city, vanishing into the countryside, a young aristocrat turned fugitive, hunted by the state that had once educated him. He hid among the hills near the Sabine lands, then drifted east, moving through villages where no one knew his name. He grew a beard in mourning, both for his uncle Marius and for the Republic he barely recognized. In time, he made his way across the sea to Asia Minor, where Roman governors ruled over old Greek cities, still filled with philosophers and temples to forgotten gods. There, amid the marble ruins of earlier empires, Caesar found something that would never leave him: perspective. He saw what power looked like when it endured across centuries, not through fear, but through structure, law, and the illusion of destiny. He began to imagine Rome not as a city or even a state, but as an idea large enough to contain the world. The seed of empire had taken root in a mind barely past youth, but even in exile, danger followed. On his journey across the Aegean, pirates captured his ship. They held him for ransom, as they did with any Roman noble they believed valuable enough to trade. When they set his price, Caesar laughed. It was too low, he said. He insisted they demand more, and they, amused by his arrogance, agreed. For 38 days he lived among them, writing poetry, giving orders, and joking that he would one day return to capture them. When the ransom was paid and he was freed, he kept his promise. He raised a small force, hunted the pirates down, and had them crucified. A young man's first act of command, cruel but deliberate. He understood what Rome admired. By 73 BC, Caesar returned to Rome under the protection of new politics. Sulla's order was fading, and a cautious sense of renewal hung over the Republic. He lived modestly, practiced law, and gained attention for his eloquence, a voice trained not only to argue but to persuade. The people noticed him. The Senate began to fear him. In court, his speeches dripped with irony and precision. He defended the oppressed, prosecuted the corrupt, and spoke in the calm rhythm of inevitability. Every case was practice, every sentence another stone laid on the long road toward destiny. Yet ambition does not survive on rhetoric alone. Rome was a city that measured men by spectacle, by victories, games, and the size of their debts. Caesar borrowed freely, spending money he did not have to host public festivals and build alliances. Behind his charm was calculation, behind his debts, investment. He was buying something larger than wealth, influence. In those years, the Republic existed in a strange balance, still a democracy in name, but increasingly a stage for personal power. Generals like Pompey and Crassus dominated the news. The Senate debated not laws but personalities. Every citizen could feel it. The Republic was aging, its skin stretched thin over the ambitions of men too large for it to contain. At night, Rome still glowed. Torchlight reflected on marble, laughter echoing through colonnades. But beneath the warmth of the city, a new rhythm was forming, quiet yet certain. The next age would belong to those who understood movement, not restraint. Caesar watched and learned. He spoke little, smiled often, and waited. But waiting in Rome was never passive. It was an art. The art of reading men as if they were landscapes, of knowing which hills to climb and which to walk around. Caesar moved quietly through the city, attending dinners where senators measured each other's words like wagers. He listened, nodded, and spoke only when it would be remembered. Those who met him described a man of contradictions, generous yet calculating, friendly yet impossible to know. He wore his ambition like perfume, faint, pleasant, but unmistakable. Behind the laughter and the courtesy was something colder, a mind arranging the pieces of a game only he seemed to understand. When opportunity called, he accepted a post in Bithynia, across the sea, as an envoy of the Republic. It was meant to be routine, assisting the Roman governor, managing debts, negotiating with the local king, but it became another lesson. He saw firsthand how Rome's allies bowed in public, yet ruled themselves in private, how influence depended not on law but on presence. Power, he realized, was less about titles than about being indispensable at the right moment. On his return voyage, he sailed past the ruins of Troy. He stood on deck at dusk, the coastline fading into shadow, and wondered how many empires had thought themselves eternal. The sea rolled beneath him, patient and endless, and he thought of Rome, restless, hungry, unable to rest even after victory. When he reached the city again, the streets felt narrower, the air thicker. The Republic he had left was already shifting. Pompey was rising, Crassus was counting his fortune, and in every tavern men argued over who would shape the future. Caesar said little. He walked the streets at night, past the rostra where laws were once proclaimed and now served as decoration, past temples where marble gods stared down at worshippers who no longer believed. He saw not decline, but opportunity. Sometimes he paused on the Capitoline Hill to watch the torches of processions below. The city shimmered, gold light on stone, the hum of voices floating upward. It looked eternal, but he could feel movement beneath it, slow and certain, like a tide turning. He understood even then that history doesn't shout when it changes course. It exhales. And in that quiet breath between the world that was and the world to come, Gaius Julius Caesar began to step forward. Rome had learned to live with contradiction. Temples rose higher, laws grew longer, but faith in both was shrinking. The Senate spoke of tradition while trading favors behind shaded porticos. Merchants praised civic virtue as they smuggled grain through the night, and the people, weary of speeches, wanted spectacle. They no longer asked who was right, only who was strong. Caesar sensed it instinctively. He saw that the Republic's bones were still firm, but its heartbeat had changed rhythm. Power now moves through personality, not process. Every ambitious man learned to turn his life into theater. He would soon learn the same. His first great opportunity came not on a battlefield, but in the city itself. In 63 BC, when Rome prepared to elect a new Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Republic, few believed Caesar, barely 40, buried in debt, had any chance. The post was both sacred and political. It brought residence on the forum, command of the calendar, and a lifetime of visibility. Two older senators stood against him, men of dignity and fortune. Caesar had charm, daring, and nothing left to lose. He borrowed more money than he could ever repay and spent it all on persuasion. banquets, public works, gifts of grain. When friends warned him of ruin, he smiled and said, "If I lose, I shall be in debt. If I win, it will pay itself." He won. At dawn, his supporters carried him through the streets, shouting his name. The city that once feared his lineage now worshipped his boldness. From that morning, the title Pontifex Maximus followed him like a shadow, a man both priest and politician, blessing the Republic while quietly rewriting its rituals. That same year, the Catilinarian conspiracy shook Rome. A noble named Lucius Sergius Catilina plotted to overthrow the Senate, and the orator Cicero exposed him in thunderous speeches that echoed through the Curia. The city teetered on panic. Executions were demanded. Caesar, sitting among the senators, argued for restraint, not mercy, but legality. He warned that killing citizens without trial would teach future rulers to do the same. The words chilled the chamber. He lost the vote, yet won something subtler, the image of reason against hysteria. Even his enemies began to admit his danger lay not in violence, but in vision. That night, as the condemned conspirators were led to death, Cicero called himself savior of the Republic. Caesar said nothing. He simply noted how easily Rome now used that word, savior, and how fragile salvation must be if it needed declaring so often. Over the next few years, he served as praetor, then propraetor in Hispania Ulterior, far Spain, a land of mountains and gold mines. There, he commanded legions for the first time. He pacified tribes, balanced taxes, and more importantly, learned how soldiers loved. They admired generosity, clarity, and the promise of glory. Caesar gave them all three. He shared their hardships, marched beside them, and rewarded loyalty with public praise. When his term ended, his troops called him Imperator, the commander. On his return to Rome, he paused before a small statue of Alexander the Great in Gades. He was 35, younger than Alexander had been at death, and he wept, saying, "At this age Alexander conquered the world, and I have done nothing." Those around him laughed nervously, but history was already listening. By 60 BC, Rome's politics had hardened into rival camps. The Senate clung to dignity, the people's tribunes shouted reform. In that tension, Caesar saw opportunity once again. He brokered what later writers would call the First Triumvirate, an informal pact among himself, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey supplied prestige, the hero of Eastern wars. Crassus provided wealth, the richest man in Rome. Caesar offered energy, eloquence, and a public adored by the crowd. Together they bypassed the Senate entirely, turning cooperation into quiet domination. Each gained what he desired. Pompey's veterans received land, Crassus secured favorable contracts, and Caesar obtained the jewel of all appointments, the governorship of Gaul. It was meant as exile, a posting to the wild frontier. He knew better. Gaul was a canvas large enough to paint his legend. Before leaving, he gave lavish games, spending sums so vast that creditors crowded his door like pilgrims at a shrine. He rode out of Rome smiling, owing more than any man alive, and confident that conquest would pay it back with interest. As his convoy moved north through Italy, the city behind him resumed its rhythm. Auctions, trials, gossip, prayers. But cracks widened beneath the marble. The Senate had lost authority, yet clung to etiquette. The people had found their voice, yet lacked direction. Even the gods seemed to stand aside, as if the story had moved beyond their control. In taverns, men debated rumors of invasion or famine. On the rostra, politicians raised their hands to calm crowds they secretly feared. And far away, on the road to Gaul, a single man rode toward destiny, his cloak dust-stained, his thoughts already years ahead. Rome had not yet fallen, but the silence between its ceremonies had begun to hum, the low, inevitable sound of change. The road north from Rome wound through the green folds of Etruria, where the olive trees grew in ordered lines like verses on a page. Caravans moved slowly, oxen dragged carts filled with weapons, tents, and scrolls. Somewhere among them, in a litter half open to the sunlight, rode Gaius Julius Caesar, governor designate of Gaul, leaving behind the city that had raised him and now feared him. Rome receded behind him in stages, first the smell of its hearths, then the distant hum of its markets, then the soft echo of bells from the Capitoline. He did not look back often. Those who traveled with him said he spent most of the journey in silence, writing letters, calculating expenses, and studying the reports of the provinces he was about to rule. For a man who had never commanded a major war, He prepared as if he already knew the scale of the one to come. The Republic was entering another election year, and already factions whispered that Caesar's posting would keep him conveniently far from the city. Distance, they thought, would tame him. But distance, for men like Caesar, was freedom. Before he left, tragedy had struck. His wife Cornelia had died after years of quiet devotion. He had delivered her eulogy himself, a rare act of public tenderness in a society that distrusted emotion. His voice had trembled only once, when he called her the compass of my youth. Those words stayed with him now, somewhere between grief and momentum. He left Rome not as a grieving husband, but as a man suddenly lighter, freed from the last tie to his earlier, humbler self. Ambition filled the space that loss had made. At night, when his convoy camped by the road, he sat apart, watching the fires dim to embers. The soldiers talked of pay, of home, of women. He thought of maps, of mountains, of rivers whose names would one day belong to him. History often begins not with trumpets, but with quiet decisions under unfamiliar stars. Beyond the Apennines lay Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, a land both Roman and not, where Latin towns met Celtic villages and the language of the empire mixed with the accents of the frontier. The people there lived by trade and war, their loyalties shifted like the wind. To them, Rome was not a homeland but a customer. Caesar entered the region to polite acclamation. He met local chieftains, distributed gifts, and restored order to old settlements abandoned since the last wars. His governors before him had been content to collect taxes. He wanted information. He questioned traders, scouts, and farmers, learning not only the geography but the habits of the tribes beyond the border. He kept notes on the Helvetii, the Aedui, the Sequani, names that would soon echo through the history of Europe. The legions he inherited were competent but uninspired. He walked among them at dawn, speaking to soldiers by name, asking about their families, reminding them that loyalty was a two-way oath. Discipline, in Caesar's view, was not imposed. It was cultivated, like respect. Within months, their confidence shifted. The men began to speak of him with quiet pride. It was the beginning of something new. A bond between commander and army that would one day eclipse even the Republic itself. Rumors began to drift down from beyond the Alps, tribes migrating west, alliances forming, rival chieftains warring for dominance. Among them, the Helvetii, a confederation of Celtic peoples from the mountains, were said to be preparing to abandon their homeland and move en masse into Roman territory. It was an exodus of tens of thousands, families, carts, livestock, everything that could move. To the Senate, it was another distant report. To Caesar, it was an opportunity. He wrote dispatches describing the threat in careful language, not panic but necessity, and requested permission to act. When it came, he wasted no time. Rome had given him a title. He would turn it into destiny. In spring, he marched north. The air grew colder, the hills steeper, the roads less certain. He crossed the passes where snow still clung to the stones and the wind spoke in unfamiliar tones. Below, rivers twisted like veins through forests no Roman map had yet named. Here at last, the world felt wide again, unmeasured, untamed, waiting to be written upon. At the edge of Roman control, Caesar paused. The legions made camp near Geneva, and he stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, watching the smoke of the tribal fires in the distance. Somewhere beyond those hills, thousands of people were already on the move, carrying their homes on wagons, their gods in memory, seeking a new land. He thought perhaps of his own city, of how Rome too had once been a wandering tribe, its people seeking a place to rest. And now that restless energy had become an empire. He saw in the Helvetii not enemies, but reflections, proof that migration, ambition, and hunger were eternal. A general's task, he believed, was to shape that hunger into history. When he returned to his tent, he unrolled a map lit by the glow of a single lamp. The parchment shimmered slightly in the wind. He drew a line along the frontier and whispered to a scribe, "Here begins the work that will make Rome eternal." Outside, the night grew colder. The legions slept, and the quiet heartbeat of conquest began. By dawn, the army was already moving again, helmets catching the pale light, standards rising above the mist. Each footstep pressed into the soil of a land that would soon bear new names: Alesia, Gergovia, the Rhine, the Rubicon. Behind them, Rome continued as always, trials, gossip, elections, promises. But somewhere beyond its noise, the Republic's future had already shifted north. into the mind of a man who could see both the map and the story it would become. The conquest of Gaul had not yet begun, but history had started counting differently. The sound of marching fades into the rhythm of the earth, metal on stone, leather on dust, thousands of footsteps moving as one, their echoes lost in the wind that sweeps down from the Alps. It is the year 58 BC. The frontier of Roman power stretches from the mountains to the sea, but beyond those lines lies a world as old as it is untamed, the land of the Gauls. For centuries, Rome had feared the name. It was the Gauls who had once burned the city to ashes in its infancy, the ghost of that humiliation still living in the marble heart of every Roman senator. Now, the tribes stir again. The Helvetii, restless in their valleys, have begun to move. An entire people setting out to seek new soil, a migration vast enough to shift the balance of the continent. They came in columns that stretched for miles, families, oxen, wagons carrying idols and grain, their children asleep among bundles of linen and bronze. To them it was renewal. To Rome it was an invasion. Caesar, now proconsul of Gaul, watched the movement from the southern bank of the Rhone. The spring air carried the smell of wet stone and pine. Messengers from the Helvetii approached, asking for passage through Roman territory. They promised peace, but the memory of Rome's past defeat was not easily soothed by promises. Caesar replied with courtesy, then ordered bridges destroyed and trenches dug along the riverbank. The Helvetii, seeing this, turned north, a decision that would draw them, inevitably, into battle. In his commentaries, written years later, Caesar would describe the campaign in spare, precise Latin, as if the entire war were an exercise in logic. But those who were there remembered the smell of rain on armor, the tension before dawn, and the look in his eyes when he stood above the river and said, "We do not defend borders. We define them." The clash came swiftly. Near the Saône River, Helvetii began crossing on makeshift rafts and bridges of logs. Caesar struck before half their number had crossed. The morning mist hung low. Legionaries advanced in silence, shields glinting faintly in the gray. It was not the size of the battle that mattered, but the swiftness. In hours, the Roman line broke the enemy camp, capturing wagons, families, provisions. The Helvetii fell back, scattered but unbroken, and Caesar pursued. Methodically, patiently, as if measuring each mile in sentences for the book he would one day write. When at last the tribe sued for peace, he received them not as enemies but as subjects. He ordered them to return to their lands, to rebuild the villages they had abandoned. To his legions it was victory. To Caesar it was a beginning, a demonstration of what control meant when dressed as mercy. Word of his success spread quickly through the provinces. Allies sent envoys, rivals sent spies. The Senate in Rome congratulated him publicly while privately worrying about his growing fame. No Roman general had ever been so visible. His letters from Gaul read aloud in the forum like dispatches from destiny itself. In the north, other tribes watched carefully. The Aedui, Rome's allies, spoke of Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine and begun to dominate the region. Caesar listened, and in the stillness of his tent that night, he unfolded maps beneath the soft light of oil lamps. Each valley, each river, each name was a question, and he, as always, intended to answer it personally. He was not yet emperor, not yet the master of Rome, but already the world was beginning to move around him, the magnetic pull of certainty drawing both men and nations into orbit. For Caesar, war was never simply blood and soil. It was theater, policy, and philosophy. He fought with the calm of a mathematician, each maneuver a statement of cause and effect. He wrote constantly, not only to record events, but to control their meaning. To his soldiers, he appeared fearless. To his enemies, inevitable. Even the storms seemed to favor him. Yet beneath the precision was something human, something restless and aware. He once said that fortune must be seized like a lover, boldly and without hesitation. Perhaps he understood that history itself responds to confidence. Those who act without doubt carve the world before it can resist them. The soldiers saw none of this. They saw only a commander who shared their hunger and walked among them in the mud. At night, when they camped, he ate from the same pot, listened to the same songs. He was distant yet near, an illusion that would bind them to him beyond loyalty, into something almost sacred. In the evening, when the campfires burned low, the forests of Gaul whispered with the sound of rain and unseen rivers. Caesar often sat alone, dictating letters to his scribes, the rhythm of his words matching the slow crackle of flame. He spoke of roads to be built, alliances to be made, and of Rome's duty to bring light to the lands of shadow. One scribe, years later, recalled that Caesar sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening for an echo only he could hear. Perhaps it was the sound of Rome itself, that ancient heartbeat of expansion, the quiet promise that peace could only be secured through conquest. When he finished his letters, he would walk the perimeter of the camp, passing the sentries with a nod, his cloak drawn tight against the wind. Above him, the constellations shone bright and unchanging, the same stars that had watched over every empire before his. He looked up at them often, not for guidance but for context. The universe, he seemed to understand, was vast enough to forgive ambition. Spring in Gaul came late. The forests still clung to the color of ash when Caesar broke camp and moved north. Scouts rode ahead, their hooves muffled in damp earth. Behind them, 6 legions advanced like a living tide of bronze and leather. Each soldier knew the rhythm by heart. The sound of the tuba horn at dawn, the grinding of wheels, the voice of centurions calling cadence beneath the rain. They moved through valleys still haunted by mist, through fields where ancient tribes had once burned offerings to forgotten gods, and always before them, the horizon, wide and unclaimed. For the Romans, this was not wilderness but future territory. For the people who lived there, it was home. Caesar did not hate them. He simply believed they would thank him in time. The Ariovistus, king of a Germanic confederation beyond the Rhine, had crossed into Gaul years earlier and now ruled as conqueror. He claimed he was invited by the tribes themselves, an echo of every empire's excuse. To Caesar, it was a provocation and an opportunity. He summoned the chiefs of Gaul to a council, their cloaks soaked with mountain rain, their faces carved by suspicion. Through interpreters, he promised protection in exchange for obedience. Some agreed, others hesitated. He reminded them gently what Roman friendship had meant to those who resisted it before. Soon after, he marched east. The armies met near the Vosges Mountains, their banners shaking in the wind. Ariovistus rode out first, tall and fierce, his cloak of wolfskin trailing behind him. Caesar approached unarmed, speaking through a herald, a calm voice amid shouts and drums. He warned that Rome would tolerate no further German settlement west of the Rhine. Ariovistus laughed, calling the Rhine a river, not a border. Caesar returned to his camp without anger, only certainty. When battle came, it was as sudden as thunder. The legions advanced in disciplined silence, their shields overlapping like scales. Arrows rained, horses screamed, and then impact. The German line broke under the weight of order, meeting chaos. What had begun as resistance became retreat, and what had been retreat became slaughter. When it was done, the survivors fled across the Rhine. Caesar ordered no pursuit. The river itself would tell their story. After the victory, the legions built a bridge, not for crossing but for demonstration. Wooden piles drove deep into the riverbed, stones and planks woven together in perfect geometry. When it was complete, Caesar led his army across, stood on German soil for a single day, then returned and dismantled the bridge behind him. It was a message carved in timber. Rome could go anywhere, and nothing was beyond its reach. The soldiers began to speak of him differently now. They had seen generals before, brave, cunning, ambitious, but this man carried a kind of inevitability. He fought not for plunder, but for permanence. Every victory was clean, organized as if history itself were following orders. He rewarded courage with public praise, cowardice with silence, a punishment far heavier than lashes. In the evenings, he walked among the tents, asking questions, listening to complaints, remembering names. He understood what few commanders ever did, that men fight not for Rome, nor for pay, but for the one who looks them in the eye and calls them friend. The conquest of Gaul unfolded over years, a long rhythm of winter quarters and spring campaigns. Cities fell, alliances shifted, and rivers became red lines on maps sent back to the Senate. Each dispatch began the same way. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Simple words, measured, yet they carried the tone of ownership. In Rome, those letters were read aloud to crowds that cheered. Merchants celebrated, poets praised, and senators began to whisper that Caesar's fame was growing too vast for comfort. A general who commanded both the sword and the story was a danger unlike any before. But they could not silence him. His victories had become the Republic's heartbeat. The soldiers, meanwhile, learned to endure every hardship. They built roads through mountains, bridges over rivers that seemed impassable, forts that appeared overnight like cities of wood and iron. To the tribes they conquered, they were less an army than a force of nature, appearing, destroying, rebuilding, and vanishing with the seasons. Caesar saw the toll it took. He wrote of numbers and tactics, but he also watched men grow old in his service. Their faces are lined by weather and will. He promised them land, knowing Rome would hesitate to deliver it. But he meant it when he said, "I will make Rome remember you." By the third year of war, the legions moved like an organism, efficient, tireless, and almost silent. They carried with them a rhythm that outlasted music. The Gauls, divided by rivalry, could not match it. Each tribe fought bravely, then fell, until only pockets of defiance remained. In the dense forests near the Arverni, scouts reported the rise of a new leader, a young noble named Vercingetorix, whose name meant King of Great Warriors. Caesar read the report by firelight and smiled faintly. He knew what history required of him. Every conqueror needs a worthy adversary. For now, though, he let the wars rest. The legions built winter camps, and the snow fell quietly on their walls. In his tent, Caesar wrote letters to the Senate, orders for engineers, and the first lines of a book that would turn war into literature and politics into poetry. He dipped his pen into ink, paused, and wrote, "These things I did." Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere beyond the Rhine, the fires of Vercingetorix were already burning. The first snow of that winter had barely melted when word reached Caesar of revolt. It began as embers in distant villages, raided supply trains, murdered envoys, missing scouts. Then within weeks it became a flame. Across the hills of central Gaul, banners rose again. Tribes long divided by pride and old feuds now moved as one. Their leader was a young Arvernian noble, Vercingetorix, tall, fierce-eyed, and patient. He had once served in Caesar's cavalry, had watched how Romans fought, how they punished and rewarded, and he had learned. When he returned to his people, he spoke of unity. He told them that Rome could be beaten not by the sword, but by starvation, by denying Caesar the food, horses, and grain that kept his army alive. The tribes listened. For the first time in living memory, Gaul stood together. Vercingetorix's strategy was not battle, but fire. He ordered villages burned, fields cleared, granaries emptied. Better, he said, to destroy one's own home than to feed the enemy. The landscape blackened, smoke hung low for weeks. Caesar pursued, marching through ash and silence, his legions moving with the grim patience of habit. Each night, the fires glowed on the horizon, proof that resistance lived. When he finally cornered Vercingetorix near Avaricum, he found the city fortified, stocked, and defended by men who had vowed to die there. Caesar surrounded it, cut off its wells, and waited. For 25 days the siege was held. Rain fell without pause, flooding trenches and soaking tents. The soldiers grew thin, the enemy is confident. But on the 26th night, the walls fell. Caesar ordered no mercy. Of 40,000 defenders, only a few hundred survived. Afterward, he walked through the ruins. Smoke rose from collapsed roofs. Shields and bones lay tangled in the mud. He said nothing, but later wrote, "Fortune favors the brave." The phrase would outlive him. Vercingetorix withdrew north, gathering survivors as he went, retreating to the hill fort of Alesia, a stronghold of stone and timber rising above two rivers, its cliffs steep, its people defiant. There he made his stand. Caesar arrived with more than 50,000 men, and what he saw was not an enemy camp, but a fortress of resolve. He ordered his engineers to begin work. What they built was beyond imagination, a wall of encirclement nearly 11 miles long, ditches, towers, and traps. Then, when news came that a massive Gallic relief army was approaching, he ordered a second wall, this one facing outward, to defend against attack from outside. Between the two, his army, trapped and determined. For weeks, the siege was held. Gauls attacked from both sides, Romans fought without sleep. At night, the fires of both camps lit the horizon like twin constellations. The earth trembled with shouts, drums, and iron, and through it all, Caesar remained calm. He rode along the inner line at dawn, his horse flecked with mud, his cloak as stiff with frost. He spoke to centurions by name, to archers from Crete, to engineers from Sicily, to slaves hauling stones. He reminded them, The world remembers not those who build walls, but those who endure behind them. The soldiers, exhausted but enthralled, answered with cheers that carried across the valley. In that moment, faith itself became a weapon. When the relief army finally attacked, it came like a wave. The ground shook with cavalry charges. Arrows darkened the sky. Caesar's men fought on both fronts, outward and inward, a human wheel of discipline turning against chaos. At the height of the battle, Caesar himself led a countercharge, his red cloak bright against the dust. He fought not as a symbol but as a soldier, driving the line forward until the enemy broke. The relief army scattered. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix watched from the walls and knew the war was lost. The next morning, he rode down from the gates on horseback, unarmed, wearing his best armor. He circled Caesar's camp once, then dismounted before the Roman general, removed his sword and laid it at his feet. He said nothing. He did not need to. Caesar accepted the surrender without a word. The two men, reflections of each other, stood in silence, the conquered and the conqueror bound by the same understanding, that history is always written by the one who endures. The war was over, but peace, as always, was a longer siege. Gaul lay quiet now, its towns rebuilt under Roman order, its roads stretching outward like veins of empire. Trade returned, then taxes, then temples. The world had shifted again, and most of its people did not even notice. Vercingetorix was taken to Rome, kept in chains for 6 years, and paraded through the streets during Caesar's triumph. When the cheering ended, he was quietly executed. His death, like his rebellion, became legend, not for its violence, but for its dignity. Caesar, meanwhile, wrote of the war with the same calm detachment he had shown in fighting it. He called it the Gallic War, and in its pages he turned conquest into prose and prose into permanence. Each line was measured, each victory described without pride. He knew that the truest display of power is to narrate reality as if it were inevitable. At the end of the campaign, he stood again on a ridge, looking over the valleys he had claimed. The forests moved like waves in the wind, the rivers glowed silver in the dusk. He thought of the years spent here, of men lost, of roads built, of languages that would soon forget their own words. He did not smile, he only said, "The work is done, now the reckoning begins." Below him, the legions cheered. They believed he meant Rome's gratitude, he meant Rome's fear. The wars in Gaul had lasted nearly a decade. By the time Caesar returned to the borders of Italy, he was no longer simply a general, he was a phenomenon. Behind him marched men who had followed him through storms, sieges, and starvation. They had built his legend brick by brick, and now the weight of that legend pressed against the gates of the Republic itself. Rome had celebrated his victories. It had cheered the news from Alesia, admired the wealth and slaves and grain that poured in from the north. But admiration in politics is only the polite disguise of fear. The Senate saw what was coming. They saw in Caesar not another hero, but the mirror of what they had become, a man larger than the laws that claimed to bind him. While Caesar camped at Ravenna, the Senate debated in endless circles. Pompey the Great, once his ally, now stood against him, the sword of the Republic drawn by pride and old jealousy. He commanded the city's loyalty, its generals, its treasury, but he lacked the thing Caesar carried effortlessly, momentum. News came by courier. The Senate, urged by Pompey, had ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he refused, he would be declared an enemy of the state. He read the message in silence, then folded it neatly and set it aside. Around him, his officers waited, their faces unreadable in the flicker of the brazier's light. He looked at them one by one, then said quietly, "If I cross this river, I carry war. If I stay, I accept humiliation. There is no middle road." The river lay ahead, a narrow, shallow stream called the Rubicon, small enough to step across, large enough to divide eras. That night, Caesar walked alone to the riverbank. The moon hung low, its reflection rippling on the water. Behind him, the murmur of soldiers waiting for a command drifted through the mist like the breathing of a single vast creature. He paused, watching the water slide over smooth stones, and perhaps he thought of all the choices that had led him here. His youth under Sulla's shadow, his exile, his return, his victories in Gaul, the friends who had become enemies, and the republic that had mistaken structure for strength. He turned to his men. They looked at him not with doubt, but devotion. To them, Rome was not a city, it was wherever he stood. He lifted his hand and said simply, "The die is cast." Then he stepped forward, crossing the Rubicon. The sound of water against boots was soft, but it echoed through centuries. Word traveled faster than the wind. By dawn, the Senate had fled the city. Pompey withdrew south, claiming he would raise legions from every province loyal to the old order. In the Forum, the statues of gods looked down upon empty streets. Rome, for the first time in generations, had no government, only sides. Caesar entered the city without resistance. He forbade looting, forbade revenge. He walked through the Curia, the Senate chamber still smelling of wax and dust, and said quietly, "They have left nothing for us to conquer but the peace itself." He stayed only days, then moved on, not to rule but to pursue Pompey. He understood that power unfinished is power wasted. Pompey retreated to Greece, gathering fleets, senators, and remnants of an old republic. He called himself defender of liberty, but his words rang hollow. Caesar followed with his legions, crossing seas that seemed to part at his command. The world watched, breath held, as two visions of Rome prepared to collide. In the east, Caesar wrote letters to his allies, always calm, always confident. He offered pardons to enemies, promised peace to cities that opened their gates, and spoke often of reconciliation, not because he needed it, but because mercy, in victory, is the highest form of control. One night aboard his ship, a storm rose suddenly. Waves battered the hull, lightning split the sky, and the captain hesitated to sail. Caesar, drenched in rain, gripped the man's shoulder and said, "Sail on, for you carry Caesar and his fortune." The sea obeyed. Every victory draws its shadow. Caesar began to sense that his rise had become something larger than intent, a movement of time itself. The Republic had not been destroyed by ambition, but by exhaustion. Its rituals, its checks and balances were like the statues in its squares, beautiful, unchanging, and no longer alive. He did not yet know where this would end, in empire or in ruin, but he understood that hesitation was the only unforgivable sin. When he reached the shores of Greece, his scouts reported that Pompey's army was vast, nearly twice his size. His officers urged caution. Caesar simply smiled. "Then we have room enough for victory." He ordered campfires lit across the hills, so many that the night itself seemed to burn. To his men, he said nothing of fear or fate. He spoke only of Rome, and of the need to restore what had long been lost, not the Republic as it was, but the order it had once promised to be. And in that stillness before dawn, as the fires dimmed and the sky turned gray, the soldiers slept. History, however, did not. Morning broke over the plains of Pharsalus. A thin mist drifted across the fields, softening the edges of the distant mountains. To the west, Caesar's legions stood in silence, shields resting against their knees. To the east, the campfires of Pompey the Great flickered, their smoke rising like slow prayers to forgotten gods. The two armies faced one another across a narrow valley, each waiting for the other to move first, each knowing that this day would decide not only who ruled Rome, but what Rome itself would become. Caesar, calm as ever, rode along the line of his men. He had slept little. He always slept little before great things. To his officers he gave brief instructions, no long speeches, no appeals to glory. He simply said, "The time for words is done." Pompey, on the opposite ridge, watched through the morning haze. He had once been called Magnus, the Great, the conqueror of the East, the man who had cleared the seas of pirates, the darling of the Senate. Now, he commanded senators who doubted him, and an army that followed him more from tradition than faith. He had wanted to avoid this battle. He had believed time would erode Caesar's support, that the Republic's structure would hold. But the Republic was already gone, only its echo remained. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of olive wood and dust. A standard fluttered above Caesar's line, the golden eagle glinting faintly in the weak sun. Caesar looked across the valley, his gaze fixed on Pompey's banners. There was no hatred in him, only a kind of distant sadness, as if he understood that this was not victory over an enemy, but surgery on something too diseased to heal. He dismounted, walked a few paces into the open, and touched the earth. The soil was cool, the same soil on which generations of Roman farmers had once toiled. He whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps nothing, then returned to his men. The signal horn sounded once. Thousands of feet pressed into the dirt. The battle of Pharsalus had begun. Pompey's army was twice the size of Caesar's. Its cavalry outnumbered him 5-1. The Senate had promised victory before nightfall. Pompey himself had told his officers, "All I need to do is stamp my foot, and Italy will rise." Caesar had heard the boast and remembered it with amusement. When the lines clashed, the sound was not thunder but rhythm, metal striking metal in a grim, perfect cadence. Caesar's men fought like a memory, each movement practiced through years of discipline. Pompey's cavalry charged, sweeping around the flank as planned, but Caesar had prepared for it. He had hidden a fourth line of reserves, infantry trained to strike upward into the riders' exposed sides. When they advanced, the cavalry faltered, turned, and panic spread like fire in dry grass. Within minutes, Pompey's advantage dissolved into confusion. Caesar's legions pressed forward, their silence is more terrifying than any shout. Across the field, Pompey watched as his men fell back, his banners sinking one by one into the haze. He could not comprehend it, not that he was losing, but that he was losing to inevitability. He left the field before the end. The great Pompey, once master of Rome, rode away in silence. His cloak was torn by wind. Aftermath. By afternoon, the battle was over. The plain lay still, a canvas of dust and broken standards. The air is heavy with the smell of iron. Caesar stood at the center of it. His face was unreadable. Around him, his officers congratulated one another, but he said nothing. He walked among the fallen, Roman and Roman alike. He ordered that no corpses be mutilated, no prisoners mocked. He found no joy in it. When they brought him word that Pompey had fled to Egypt, he simply nodded. He knew the chase was not yet done, but part of him seemed to drift elsewhere, as if, in winning, he had already lost something irretrievable. That night, he camped on the field itself. He dined simply, spoke quietly to his aides, and as the fires dimmed, he looked up at the sky and said, "These men were citizens." No one replied. The stars above were indifferent, the same stars that had watched over Troy and Carthage and every empire before. They would watch over Rome, too, long after its conquerors were dust. Pompey fled across the sea to Egypt, seeking refuge in the kingdom of the boy king Ptolemy XIII. But Egypt was a land of shifting loyalties. Before Caesar could arrive, Pompey was betrayed. As he stepped ashore, an officer of the king's guard struck him down. The conqueror of the East died silently in the surf, his blood mixing with the sand he had once claimed for Rome. When Caesar reached Alexandria days later, they brought him Pompey's head as a gift. He turned away in disgust, weeping for the man who had once been his ally, his rival, and the last symbol of the Republic's dignity. He ordered a proper burial, and for the first time in many years, those who served him saw something like grief on his face. He said quietly, "It is not greatness that kills us, but the fear of losing it." In the days that followed, Caesar remained in Egypt, caught in the delicate politics of a foreign throne, the story that would soon entwine his fate with Cleopatra. But that was still to come. For now the war is over. Rome belonged to him, though he had not yet claimed it. The Senate waited to see what kind of ruler he would be. The people waited to see what kind of world he would make. And Caesar, standing on the edge of a conquered sea, felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. He had crossed every boundary, defeated every rival, and found at the end of victory not triumph, but silence. He whispered into the evening air, perhaps to the gods, perhaps to the ghosts of Rome itself, "Let it be at peace." The waves rolled softly against the shore, and for a brief moment it was. The sea between Greece and Egypt was calm that winter. Caesar sailed south through the Aegean, his ships moving like shadows over still water. The air was warm, scented with salt and distance. He had won his greatest victory, but the wind that carried him now was not triumph. It was transition. Alexandria rose from the horizon like a mirage. Columns and lighthouses shimmered in the heat, the famous Pharos guiding him toward a world older than his own. Egypt, land of gods and mirrors, where power was wrapped in ceremony and silence. Here, the Nile ruled time itself. He arrived to find the kingdom divided, a civil war between the young Ptolemy III and his sister Cleopatra. The city was a mosaic of intrigue, Greek philosophers debating in courtyards, priests chanting in the temple of Isis, Roman soldiers watching with uneasy curiosity. Caesar entered not as conqueror but as arbiter, yet in truth he carried the calm authority of one who no longer needed to prove himself. Cleopatra came to him in secret. History would later dress the moment in legend, a carpet, a gift, a dramatic unrolling before the Roman general. Perhaps it happened so. But what mattered was not the spectacle. It was the meeting of two minds that understood both theater and consequence. She spoke in measured tones, her Greek soft, her presence unhurried. She did not plead, she reasoned. Egypt, she said, could be Rome's truest ally if governed by wisdom, not by boy kings and regents who bowed to fear. Caesar listened and saw not a supplicant, but an equal. They shared long conversations beneath oil lamps, speaking of politics, philosophy, and the patterns of stars. Both had lived too long inside power to be dazzled by it. Both understood that control was never seized. It was accepted, quietly, by those who needed order more than freedom. In Cleopatra, Caesar found reflection, intelligence shaped by survival, beauty sharpened by consequence. In him she found certainty, a man who did not ask permission from history. Their alliance was sealed not in ceremony, but in trust, and from that trust came a child, Caesarion, a name that would echo softly through the corridors of myth. Ptolemy, threatened and enraged, moved against them. The streets of Alexandria erupted in chaos. Roman soldiers barricaded the palace, fires burned along the quays, and the sea itself glowed orange with reflection. Caesar, cut off and outnumbered, held the palace for months. He organized defenses, negotiated with sailors, and even commanded the burning of the Egyptian fleet to prevent capture. The smoke hung over the city for days, and some said the fire reached the library of Alexandria, though no one truly knew how much was lost. Perhaps knowledge itself always burns quietly in war. At last, reinforcements arrived from Syria. Caesar broke the siege, and in a final battle along the Nile, Ptolemy's forces were routed. The boy king fled and drowned in the river's reeds. The war ended as swiftly as it had begun. When the fighting was done, Caesar did not raise trophies or parades. He simply walked along the riverbank, watching the slow current carry fragments of broken boats downstream. He said softly, "The Nile forgets quickly, Rome does not." In the months that followed, peace returned to the city. Cleopatra ruled beside him, and for a time, the world seemed briefly balanced. Two rulers, two civilizations, each admiring the other's reflection. Caesar explored the city's temples, studied its scrolls, and questioned its priests. He walked through gardens perfumed with myrrh and lotus, and listened to musicians play in the courtyards of the palace. To his soldiers, it looked as though the conqueror of Gaul had forgotten war. But he was only learning a different kind of empire, one built not by force, but by fascination. At night, he stood on the balcony overlooking the harbor, the Pharos lighthouse burning like a second sun. He would trace constellations with his finger, then turn to Cleopatra and ask how her astronomers named them. She would answer, and in her calm voice he would hear the echo of a world older than Rome, a world where power was measured in continuity, not conquest. Perhaps he envied that. Perhaps he knew he would never have it. In 46 BC he left Egypt and sailed west. Cleopatra watched from the shore. Her figure is small against the brilliance of the sea. He promised to see her again, and he would. But for now, Rome called. The journey home was marked by storms and silence. He read by lantern light, drafting laws, decrees, and reforms. He thought often of what awaited him. A Senate uneasy with his power, a people eager for order, and a republic that no longer believed in itself. When his fleet reached Italy, the shores were lined with crowds. They cheered not for a returning general, but for certainty. In their eyes he saw what all rulers eventually learn, that freedom is exhausting, and that peace, even under one man, feels merciful. He entered the city not as conqueror, but as curator. He rebuilt temples, forgave debts, and restructured the calendar. The rhythm of time itself bends quietly around his name. Every reform carried the same hidden message. Rome would now run on Caesar's order. At night, he walked through the Forum, his footsteps echoing among columns once raised to other men. The marble gleamed in the torchlight, and the air smelled faintly of rain and oil. He paused beneath the statue of Pompey, the man who had once been his rival and now his monument. He said quietly, "We all serve Rome, some in life, some in memory." Then he turned and vanished into the shadowed streets, a solitary figure in the empire he had not yet named. When Caesar returned from Egypt, the air in Rome had changed. The city that once trembled at every rumor of war now waited for instructions. Years of fear had exhausted the Senate. The people longed for silence that was not despair. Into that silence, Caesar began to build. He did not declare himself king. He understood how Rome reacted to titles. Instead, he took the old offices, consul, censor, pontifex, dictator, and layered them, one upon another, until they formed something new, a single center of gravity around which everything else revolved. He called it necessity, others called it destiny. Either way, the result was the same. He began with the calendar. It seems a small thing, but time itself had drifted out of rhythm with the seasons. The lunar months no longer matched the harvest. Caesar gathered astronomers, including scholars from Alexandria, and created what he called the Julian year, 365 days, with one day added every fourth year to keep the sun in step. It was precision made visible, and like all of his reforms, it was not about control of hours, but about the illusion of harmony restored. The people welcomed it. Merchants could plan trade, farmers could trust the seasons again. Even priests, once wary, found comfort in the regularity of festivals. The order felt like mercy. Next came the laws. He cut through the tangle of decrees that had grown wild during decades of civil strife. He reduced interest rates, abolished half the tax farming system, and replaced it with direct state collection. The Republic's middlemen, those who had profited from confusion, fell quiet. In their place rose a bureaucracy that answered to one man. He built. Always built. Temples repaired, basilicas raised, aqueducts extended. He planned a vast forum bearing his name, a new heart for a city that had outgrown its own. Stones arrived daily from quarries along the Tiber. Architects worked by lamplight through the night. Rome became a workshop of marble and sound. To the citizens, these changes felt like a sunrise. To the Senate, they felt like an eclipse. They could not fault his efficiency, only the fact that he never asked permission. In the civil wars, Caesar had shown clemency to his enemies. Now he turned that habit into policy. He recalled exiles, restored property, and opened the Senate to men from Spain, Gaul, and the provinces. It was scandalous and brilliant. He was teaching Rome to imagine itself larger than bloodlines. When critics warned him that new senators would dilute the old order, he smiled and said, "Rome does not shrink when it grows." His mercy was genuine, but it was also strategic. Men spared by Caesar owed him their futures. Men forgiven by him could never again oppose him without shame. He had found a form of conquest that required no swords. Power, once dispersed, now gathered around one presence. Every petition began with his name. Every decree ended with his seal. He refused no audience. Senators, soldiers, poets, mathematicians all came to the same threshold. He listened, decided, and moved on. It was not tyranny, it was velocity. But velocity creates distance. Friends found him harder to reach. His letters grew shorter, his handwriting sharper. Even those closest to him, Mark Antony, Calpurnia, Brutus, spoke of a certain stillness around him, as though the air itself obeyed his rhythm. At night, he dined simply, reading by lamplight the histories of Alexander, of Cyrus, of the kings of old. He no longer envied them, he studied them. Their triumphs, their downfalls, their brief illusions of safety. He marked passages about betrayal in the margins, not in fear, but in fascination. Outwardly, the Senate honored him. They voted him statues, titles, even a gilded chair in the chamber. But each honor carried the bitterness of resignation. The Republic's guardians were now its mourners. Some whispered that he aimed for monarchy, others that he had already created one in everything but name. When they addressed him as Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, some spoke the words with reverence, others with the taste of iron in their mouths. Caesar pretended not to notice. He told them, "Titles are shadows, work is substance." Yet even he began to sense the walls tightening. Every triumph widened the gap between the ruler and the ruled. The applause grew louder, but less sincere. Rome, that master of ceremony, had learned to disguise its fear with celebration. Beyond the city, his reforms spread like light on water. Colonies were founded for veterans. Roads extended through the Alps into the lands he had conquered. He planned libraries, canals, even a codified civil service. To the provinces, Caesar's Rome felt eternal. To those within its walls, it felt fragile, a perfection balanced on the will of one man. When he rode through the streets, crowds cheered with genuine warmth. Children reached out to touch his cloak. Old soldiers saluted with tears in their eyes. He always slowed his horse, acknowledged them with a nod, and moved on, his eyes distant, already elsewhere, perhaps still in Gaul, perhaps in thought. He knew that power, once accepted, cannot be shared, only survived. One evening during a ceremony, a senator placed a laurel wreath upon his head. Beneath the leaves, observers noticed a thin band of gold, a circlet, almost a crown. A murmur ran through the crowd. Caesar smiled, removed it, and handed it back. Laughter, relief, applause. But the image lingered. In that brief gesture lay the entire paradox of Rome, a people who feared kings and a ruler who was becoming one. Later that night, he confided to an aide that the crown had been heavy, not in weight, but in implication. He said softly, "Even when I refuse it, they will believe I wear it." By the end of that year, Rome gleamed under new marble, its calendar aligned with the stars, its citizens fed and employed. To all appearances, the world had been perfected. Yet perfection, in human hands, is always temporary. In private, Caesar had begun to feel the isolation of magnitude. He dreamed of campaigns in Parthia, of rebuilding Carthage, of extending Roman peace from the Atlantic to the Caspian. But he also sensed that time was narrowing. He had brought order to the world. Now the world, in gratitude and fear, was preparing to restore chaos in return. Sometimes, near midnight, Caesar would walk alone through the gardens of his villa on the Palatine. The air smelled of pine and myrtle. Fountains whispered beside marble paths. Below him, the city glowed like a living map. Thousands of lamps shimmering along the Tiber, the murmur of taverns blending with the slow chant of priests in distant temples. It was a sound both human and eternal. He paused often by the statues that lined the walk. There was Alexander, face still youthful in the moonlight. There Romulus, gripping the plow that had marked the first walls of the city. He looked at them as one might at mirrors, reflections of ambition, of creation, of loneliness. In those moments he seemed to understand what empire really was, not land or gold or titles, but the stillness at the center of motion, the fragile pause between command and obedience. He had learned to live in that pause. He knew it could not last forever. At home, Calpurnia sometimes found him awake long after midnight, reading or dictating notes to a secretary half asleep by the door. She would urge him to rest. He would smile and answer softly, "Rest is for those who have finished." He still spoke kindly, but those around him sensed the change, a distance forming between man and moment, as though he were already stepping into history while still alive. Even laughter now sounded rehearsed in his presence, too careful, too aware of its own daring. He took comfort in the company of his great-nephew, Octavian, a thin, serious boy who watched everything and forgot nothing. Caesar saw in him a quiet intelligence that needed only time. He began to tutor him in private, explaining not how to seize power, but how to keep it invisible. "The strongest walls," he told him once, "are the ones no one realizes they cannot cross." Outside, Rome slept beneath the rhythm he had imposed. The new calendar, the new coinage, the new certainty that tomorrow would arrive exactly on schedule. Yet within that order, something restless stirred, as if the city itself knew that perfection provokes its own undoing. He stood at his window and watched the moon sink behind the Capitoline. The marble gleamed pale, the statues looked alive in its glow. Somewhere in the distance a bell rang from the temple of Vesta, and a dog barked, breaking the silence. He closed his eyes. For a heartbeat he imagined the noise was applause, and then it was gone. In that stillness, he whispered, not to any god, but to time itself, "Let them believe this peace was theirs." Then he turned back to his desk, and the pen began to move again. The night after his walk in the gardens, Caesar rose before dawn. From the balcony of his villa, he watched the first light wash over Rome, the domes turning gold, the river gleaming like a drawn blade. He could smell the hearth smoke of bakers beginning their day, and somewhere below, the hooves of early messengers echoed between stone walls. It was the same city he had known all his life, yet different now, as though it looked back at him rather than he at it. He once thought greatness meant conquest, that empire was measured in miles, in cities taken and banners raised. Now, in this strange quiet, he understood that empire was something else entirely, not an act of domination, but of arrangement. The art of placing every piece so perfectly that motion itself appears still. He began to write essays few would ever read, notes on leadership, time, and the symmetry of government. He compared the state to the heavens, planets orbiting a single sun. Every orbit, he wrote, required balance. Too far and it drifted into chaos, too near and it burned. A ruler's task was not to rule, but to maintain gravity. In this, he saw himself as both astronomer and star. He invited scholars from Alexandria to discuss geometry and light, listened to their theories with the same calm curiosity he once gave battle reports. The mind that had mapped rivers now mapped ideas. He spoke often of harmony, of laws aligned with reason, of justice timed to mercy. His courtiers listened politely, not realizing he was describing not philosophy but structure, the invisible architecture of the empire. His reforms stretched outward like ripples. In Gaul, bridges and roads connected cities that had once been enemies. In Spain, veterans planted vineyards where battlefields had stood. In Greece and Asia, marble temples rose bearing both Roman and local inscriptions. He decreed that provincial governors must be citizens first, conquerors second, that taxes be light enough to encourage loyalty rather than fear. He wanted subjects to think of themselves not as conquered, but as participants in Rome's rhythm. To the Senate, this was policy. To Caesar, it was art. He imagined a single world bound by language, law, and calendar, the seasons turning together like gears in a cosmic clock. Peace, he said once to a friend, is not the absence of war. It is the perfection of control. Yet even as he spoke the words, he seemed to doubt them. The more perfect his Rome became, the more he felt the tremor beneath it. Power had never frightened him. Predictability did. He missed the danger of the frontier, the smell of pine smoke, the sudden certainty of command. Now every day arrived like a copy of the one before. He ruled the world, but the world no longer resisted him. And without resistance, identity matters. He dreamed of Parthia, of crossing the Euphrates and finishing what Crassus had failed to do. He planned it obsessively, routes, supply lines, seasons. He told his generals that a new campaign would cleanse Rome's restlessness. They agreed eagerly, but in private wondered if the city could bear another victory. Each triumph had made him greater, and greatness, they knew, isolates like altitude. That winter, Calpurnia woke one night in tears. She told him she had dreamed of the house collapsing, of the roof falling inward, of blood on the marble. He comforted her, smiling gently as though to soothe a child. Dreams, he said, are the way fear rehearses for what it cannot prevent. He promised to stay home the next day, but before dawn he was already dressed for the Senate. He left quietly, pausing only to look back once at the sleeping figure on the bed. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair. He thought how strange it was that even those who loved him most seemed to see prophecy in every shadow. In the weeks before the planned Parthian campaign, he summoned Octavian again. The boy had grown, still slender, still cautious, but with eyes that watched everything. They walked together through the forum. The marble is still wet from rain. Caesar pointed to the statues of Rome's founders and said, "You will see their mistakes before you repeat them. Remember that mercy lasts longer than monuments." Octavian listened, saying little. He understood that this was more than advice. It was inheritance disguised as conversation. When they parted, Caesar rested his hand on the boy's shoulder a moment longer than usual. History would later mark that gesture as the passing of a crown, though neither of them yet called it that. In the new temple of Venus Genitrix, the goddess he claimed as his ancestor, Caesar once stood before the altar alone. Light from the open roof fell across the marble floor, catching in the dust like smoke. He looked up at the statue, the serene face, the perfect symmetry, the illusion of eternity. He realized that every god Rome had ever made was a reflection of the men who built them. Each divinity an idealization of ambition. He wondered if one day someone would build a temple for him. The thought did not comfort him. It frightened him. For what is divinity, he asked himself, but memory stripped of forgiveness? He left the temple in silence, his footsteps echoing in the hollow air. That night, from the same balcony where the act began, he watched lightning far away over the hills. The storm did not reach Rome. It flashed and faded, too distant to bring rain. He leaned on the rail, listening to the faint hiss of wind in the trees. Below, the city breathed, market fires dying, dogs barking, the low chant of a night watch changing shift. He felt both guardian and prisoner of this stillness. He said quietly, to no one in particular, "Perhaps empire is only the echo of one man's order, and when he is gone, the echo will fade. The words hung in the air, soft, uncertain, and quickly lost. Then he turned away, and the balcony was empty again. The next morning, Caesar attended the games in the circus. He sat high above the track, the crowd rising to greet him in a single motion, tens of thousands of voices blending into one sound, like the sea against a breakwater. He lifted his hand only once, and the noise fell instantly to silence. Even the horses seemed to pause, as though the whole city breathed at his signal. He had arranged the spectacles himself, gladiators, naval battles, wild beasts from Africa, but his true purpose was not entertainment. It was reassuring. Rome had known too much chaos, now it needed ritual. He wanted the people to see rhythm again, to remember that the heart of the world still beats in time. When the chariots thundered past, the wind carried dust and petals up to his seat. He watched calmly, almost detached. Below, men shouted his name. Some called him father of the nation, others whispered king. He smiled at neither. He knew that adoration is the final stage of fear. The Republic had not vanished. It had simply forgotten how to stand upright without support. He had become that support, and supports are not loved, only leaned upon. That evening, the priests of Jupiter came to his house with a proposal. They wanted to dedicate a new temple, not to any god, but to Clementia, the spirit of mercy, with Caesar as its living embodiment. He declined at first, then, seeing the eagerness in their eyes, realized refusal would only make them more insistent. He agreed, but requested that his statue be smaller than the goddesses. It was a gesture of modesty that only confirmed what it denied. Within weeks, sculptors filled the workshop courtyards. New images of Caesar appeared across the city, on altars, coins, mosaics, even signet rings. He did not order them. They appeared by instinct, as if Rome itself were teaching its people how to remember him. When he walked through the Forum, he sometimes caught sight of his own likeness in marble. He would pause for a moment, as though seeing a stranger. Then he would turn away, troubled not by vanity, but by recognition. He was beginning to understand how thin the line is between memory and worship. Later that week, he hosted a small dinner, only a handful of senators and poets. They reclined on couches, listening to music played on flutes and lyres. Wine glowed amber in shallow cups. Someone asked if he believed the gods still guided Rome. He thought for a moment, then answered, "Perhaps the gods were only our way of describing the order we hoped to find." The guests nodded politely, unsure whether it was piety or philosophy. After they left, he remained alone in the fading candlelight, the city humming softly beyond the walls. He poured the last of the wine onto the floor, a libation not to the gods, but to time. From his window, he watched Rome sleeping again. The lamps of the Forum burned low, the statues gleaming faintly under the moon. He thought of everything he had built, of roads reaching to the edges of the known world, of legions at rest in provinces once wild. And for the first time, he wondered not how long the peace would last, but whether peace itself could survive without him. He whispered, "They have learned to live in order. But have they learned why?" There was no answer, only the slow, endless murmur of the river below. The months that followed were strangely still. The city functioned perfectly. Grain arrived on time, courts ran without delay, and the people celebrated festivals that no longer required supervision. Order had become instinct. Yet beneath the marble calm, something in the air began to shift. The Senate met rarely now, and when it did, the sessions were brief and cautious. Speeches were shorter, arguments quieter, as though words themselves might betray intention. Every man knew that one look from Caesar could end a career or restore it. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. The old senators called it peace. The younger ones called it suffocation. Caesar's days followed a pattern. Petitions in the morning, decrees at noon, reports from the provinces in the afternoon. He still walked among the people occasionally, but his guards kept a respectful distance that was not meant to be reassuring. He dined with friends, but fewer than before. Even Mark Antony, once a constant companion, spoke to him now with a formality that felt like absence. Letters arrived daily from every corner of the empire, addressed not to the Senate but to him. He answered most himself. His handwriting is still sharp and deliberate. Each reply felt like a thread tying him more tightly to a world that could not exist without him. At night, he sometimes paused over his desk, quill hovering, as though the act of writing required more belief than the words themselves could carry. Among the senators, whispers began to circulate. They spoke in courtyards and gardens, never indoors. They wondered why he had accepted the title dictator for life. Why did he no longer rise when they entered the chamber? Why did statues of him appear beside those of gods? No one could point to a single crime, but everyone felt the weight of inevitability pressing down like dust. Some argued for patience, that Caesar's rule would bring stability enough to outlast his lifetime. Others, like Cassius, spoke of honor, of the Republic's old dignity. They quoted laws no one obeyed anymore, oaths no one remembered taking. Each argument ended in silence, the kind of silence that becomes a decision. Even Brutus, the most reluctant of them, found himself caught between memory and duty. He loved Caesar as a father, but loved the idea of Rome as something older, holier. He began to wonder which was real. That winter, omens multiplied. A statue struck by lightning, a slave claiming to see fire in the sky, a lion wandering through the streets at dusk. So many rumors that even the priests stopped recording them. The city had always loved superstition. Now it clung to it, as though fate might be persuaded by attention. One afternoon, while leaving the Curia, a seer stopped Caesar and warned, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar smiled, acknowledging the man with a nod. "The Ides come every month," he said, "and yet here I still am." He walked on. Those nearby laughed softly, but a few did not. Something in the ease of his tone sounded too final. As winter faded, Caesar held a final banquet before the campaign season. The hall glowed with lamplight, gold cups reflecting the warm pulse of fire. Senators, poets, and generals reclined together, their laughter measured, their glances sharp. Caesar spoke little. He seemed preoccupied, watching the faces around him as though committing them to memory. When someone toasted to his coming campaign in Parthia, he raised his cup, but his eyes were elsewhere, somewhere beyond the walls, where memory and prophecy meet. He said quietly, "We build our victories on trust, and trust, like marble, cracks without sound." The words lingered longer than the music. Later that night, after the guests had gone, he lingered in the empty hall. The servants were clearing the tables, the last candles flickered in their holders. He touched the rim of his cup, traced a drop of spilled wine with his finger, and said softly, "So much silence for a city of voices." Outside, the people still adored him. They called out blessings when he passed, placed garlands on his statues, and swore by his name in the marketplaces. Some even prayed to him, half in jest, half in hope. He saw it and felt no pride, only weariness. He had given them peace, and peace had made them dreamless. They no longer asked questions of Rome. They only awaited instructions. He told Calpurnia once, "They love peace more than the reason for it." Perhaps that is how freedom ends, not in rebellion, but in relief. She said nothing, but placed her hand over his. He noticed how small it felt, and how heavy his own had become. In the days leading to the Senate's next session, the air in Rome grew heavy with waiting. Messengers rode more quickly, doors shut more quietly. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. On the evening of March 14th, a storm gathered over the city. Thunder rolled across the hills. Rain swept through the streets, turning torchlight into smears of gold. In the palace, Caesar stood before his window again, watching the lightning flash above the forum. He thought of his armies waiting to march east, of unfinished reforms, of promises he would never keep. He thought of the boy Octavian and how calm his eyes had been. For the first time, he felt not fear, but "I'm tired." He said aloud, "If it is to end, let it end awake." Then he turned from the storm, extinguished the lamp, and went to sleep. Morning came pale and uncertain, the sky washed in thin gold over the rooftops of Rome. The storm had passed, leaving the streets slick with light. In the palace on the Palatine, servants moved quietly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled against mosaic floors still damp from the rain. Caesar woke early, as always. For a moment he lay still, listening to the distant hum of the city below. Rome was never silent, but at dawn it spoke softly, a cartwheel turning, a vendor's call, the splash of water drawn from fountains. He took comfort in that rhythm, the steady pulse of the city he had rebuilt. Calpurnia entered with the morning light behind her. Her face was drawn, her voice hushed. She told him that she had dreamed again, of blood on his statue, of crowds crying out his name not in joy but in horror. She begged him not to go to the Senate. "Stay home, my love," she said. "Let the gods have their way without you for one day." He smiled faintly, took her hand and said, "If we give fear one day, it will ask for it every day after." As he dressed, friends and attendants entered one by one. Decimus Brutus arrived first, hands clasped behind his back, voice smooth, reassuring. He told Caesar that the Senate awaited him impatiently, that new honors were to be decreed, and that to stay away might appear distrustful. Caesar hesitated, half turning toward Calpurnia, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "If they mean to crown me with ceremony, I shall not insult them with caution." He donned his crimson cloak, the same he had worn at Pharsalus, and the laurel wreath that hid the scars of his illness. As his attendants fastened his sandals, a servant approached with a note, a warning from a loyal senator, detailing a plot, a list of names. Caesar tucked it into his hand absent-mindedly, intending to read it on the way. Outside, the streets glittered with puddles. The air smelled of rain and iron. He stepped into his litter, the curtains drawn back so that he could watch the city unfold as he passed. Children waved from doorways, vendors bowed their heads. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same mixture of affection and distance, as though Rome itself were whispering farewell. The litter moved slowly down the slope of the Palatine. Sunlight struck the marble of new temples. Flags stirred in the morning wind. At the foot of the hill, a crowd had gathered to greet him. They shouted blessings, threw garlands at his feet. He smiled, acknowledging them with a raised hand. The procession paused near the Forum, where the seer who had warned him of the Ides waited among the crowd. Caesar saw him and laughed softly. "The Ides of March have come," he said. The seer answered, "Aye, Caesar, but they are not yet gone." For a moment, something in the air seemed to still, a faint echo beneath the noise of the city. Then the litter moved on. The Senate met that day not in the old Curia, which was under repair, but in the portico of Pompey's theater, the irony unnoticed by most, unspoken by all. The statue of Pompey stood at the far end of the hall, looming above the marble floor like a silent witness. Caesar's guards remained outside. It was a day for ceremony, not protection. He stepped into the chamber with measured ease, greeting the senators by name as he passed. They rose to meet him, smiling too widely, their hands folded neatly in their robes. The light slanted in from the high windows, dust motes swirling like ash in sunlight. He took his seat at the center, the golden chair that marked his authority. A few courtiers pressed near to hand him petitions. Among them was Tullius Cimber, holding a scroll in both hands, his eyes bright, his voice respectful. He stepped closer. "Pardon my brother, sir," he said. "He begs your mercy." Caesar began to answer, but Cimber reached out suddenly, grasping his shoulders. The movement was quick, practiced. A cry rang out, and then another. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then Casca struck. The blade glanced across Caesar's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. Caesar turned sharply, seeing faces he had known for years. Cassius, Decimus, Trebonius, each with daggers drawn, each expression fixed between terror and resolve. He caught Casca's arm, but another blow came, then another. The senators surged forward, robes flaring like wings, steel flashing in the sunlight. The chamber filled with the sound of breath, of fabric tearing, of something immense ending quietly. He stumbled back toward the foot of Pompey's statue. Blood splattered the marble. Someone struck again and again. He turned once more, saw Brutus step through the circle. For a moment the two men looked at each other, teacher and student, father and son. "You too, my child." The words were not anger, not disbelief, but recognition. Then he drew his cloak around himself, covering his face, and fell. For several breaths, no one moved. The sound of dripping blood echoed faintly in the stillness. Then someone exhaled, and the noise of the city returned, distant, detached, as though nothing had changed. The senators stood panting, their hands trembling, daggers slick with what they had convinced themselves was justice. Outside, the crowd waited for news. When the doors opened, the conspirators emerged pale and shaking. They raised their hands to the sky and cried out, "Thus dies the tyrant," but no cheer followed. The people stared, confused, afraid to move. The echo of their words fell flat against the marble walls and died there. Inside, the attendants crept back into the chamber. They found Caesar's body at the foot of Pompey's statue, the folds of his cloak still gathered around his face. A pool of blood spread slowly beneath him, darkening the veins of the marble. One of the slaves whispered a prayer, another covered the wounds with trembling hands. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, the laurel wreath slipped from his head. It rolled across the floor, stopping at the base of the statue, a crown without a king. They carried him out through the side door, into the same sunlight he had greeted that morning. The sky was clear again, the air is sweet after the rain, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of the city began to toll. For a long time after the killing, Rome didn't move. The Forum stood in a strange half-stillness, like a held breath. People gathered in clusters, whispering, looking up toward the Senate building, and then back down again, as if afraid to be seen looking for too long. No one knew, in those first moments, what they were allowed to feel. Some had loved him, some had feared him, some had needed him simply because he kept the world predictable. Now all of that had been cut away in a single morning. Along the steps of the temples, merchants let their baskets rest untouched. Bread went unsold. A woman who had come to buy oil for her household stove found herself just sitting on the stone ledge with the jug in her lap, not moving, not blinking, as if waking too abruptly from a dream. A courier on horseback stood in the street, reins slack, waiting for an order that no longer existed. The conspirators had expected celebration. They had imagined, in the secrecy of their planning, that the death of Caesar would feel like the lifting of a weight, that the people would cheer the return of the Republic, would hail them as restorers of liberty, saviors of tradition. But what filled the streets was not a relief. It was dreadful. Because in their hearts, even the poorest citizens knew something the killers did not want to face. You do not break the center of gravity and expect the world to hang in the air. Inside the hall where Caesar had fallen, the senators who had taken part in the plot began to withdraw in small groups. Their robes were stained at the edges. A few still shook from adrenaline, trying to slow their breathing as if slow breathing might make their hands stop shaking. They told themselves, and one another, that history would understand, that posterity would call this day the rebirth of the Republic, that they had not murdered a man. They had instead killed a threat. They repeated these words because they needed them to be true. Cassius urged them to move quickly, to get to the Capitoline Hill, to fortify their story and hold the high ground if there was unrest. Brutus tried to speak calmly, to convince the others and himself that the people would listen to reason if reason was given a voice. But even Brutus, who had always believed in Rome more than he believed in his own safety, felt something cold beginning to move through him. He had expected pain. He had even expected guilt. He had not expected the silence, not hatred, not rage, silence. The kind of silence that feels like the whole city stepping backward at once. Caesar's corpse was carried not to a palace, not to a parade ground, but to his home. The streets cleared as the stretcher passed. Some people bowed their heads, others turned away and covered their mouths. A few reached out to touch the hem of his cloak as it trailed from the litter, like pilgrims pressing fingers to a relic. The men carrying him walked slowly, not only from grief but from reverence. Even in death, he felt heavy, not physically, spiritually, as if the air around him resisted letting go. When they reached his house, the doors were opened without ceremony. Servants and household guards, who until that morning had lived inside the glow of proximity to the most powerful man alive, now stood useless in their own doorway, like sailors on a ship whose mast had just snapped. They laid him on a table. Someone brought water. Someone else brought linen. An older woman, a servant who had been in the household for years, smoothed his hair back from his forehead and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth with slow, shaking hands. There were 23 wounds, they whispered, some deep, some are shallow, some are almost hesitant, not all meant to kill, but together it is impossible to survive. Calpurnia arrived moments later. No scream left her body. She folded over him and pressed her forehead to his chest and simply stayed there. Her shoulders moved, but no sound came out. Grief, when it's that large, is often silent. The sound arrives later. Words spread outward in waves. By midday, men were running through back alleys to warn friends which streets to avoid, as if war had already begun. Shopkeepers pulled shutters closed. Families barred doors. A group of veterans, men who had followed Caesar in Gaul, men who still bore scars from Alesia and Pharsalus, gathered in one of the squares and argued in low voices about marching straight to the killers' houses and dragging them into the street. One of them, an older centurion with a healed break along his jaw, said, "If we do that now, we'll burn the city. And if we burn the city, we lose him twice." They stayed where they were. They watched. They waited. Rome is good at waiting right before it stops waiting. On the Tiber docks, where barges brought in grain from across the sea, workers put down their ropes and just leaned against the crates, looking toward the Forum. It felt like an eclipse. Everyone sensed that something huge had moved in front of the light, and that nothing, after this, would be completely bright again. By afternoon, Brutus and the others tried to speak to the people. They walked out among the crowd with their hands raised, shouting that Rome was free, that tyranny had ended, that this had been for the good of all. A few even pointed to their blood-stained robes as proof of sacrifice, as if to say, "See, we risked ourselves. We did this for you." But the crowd did not come closer. They did not throw flowers in thanks. They did not carry the liberators on their shoulders. They backed away. A woman's voice from somewhere deep in the mass of bodies finally cut through. Who protects us now? That was the question. Not was he a king, not was he right, just who protects us now? Because for all his ambition, for all his control, Caesar had kept grain flowing, debt forgiven, roads repaired, veterans settled, riots quieted. He had kept fear predictable. He had made the world make sense. He had been, to many ordinary Romans, not a tyrant, but a guarantee. Security, not philosophy, decides loyalties. Brutus heard that question, who protects us now, and for the first time felt truly unsteady. He believed he had saved Rome. They believed he had removed the roof. Mark Antony had not joined the assassination. He had been delayed, intentionally delayed, by conspirators who feared he might interfere. Now he moved through the city like a controlled fire. He said little in public at first. He listened. He measured. He understood the mood the way a seasoned soldier understands wind and terrain. He visited Caesar's house. When they let him inside, he stood over the body for a long time without speaking. His face was unreadable, almost calm. He reached out, gently lifted the corner of the cloak, and saw the wounds with his own eyes. Then he covered him again. When he finally spoke, he didn't speak like a grieving friend. He spoke like a strategist at the edge of a battlefield. "They've killed him," he said quietly, "and they don't even know what they've done to themselves." To the servants, to Calpurnia, to the loyal officers gathered in the doorway, he made a promise. "There will be a funeral," he said, "in the Forum, before everyone. He will not leave this world like a criminal pulled into the dark. Rome will look at what Rome has done." Those words were not comforting. They were ignited. As evening fell, lamplight bloomed again along the streets, and Rome began to murmur instead of whisper. People were still scared, but fear was starting to choose a direction. The story was already moving. Not, Caesar wanted to be king. Not, the conspirators saved the Republic. But rather, they murdered him. They surrounded him like cowards. They stabbed him while he sat unarmed. That is how memory begins, not with accuracy, but with shape. And the shape forming in the public mind was simple: betrayal. Somewhere in the Subura district, a clay bust of Brutus was pulled down from a household shrine. Somewhere else, a boy was heard chanting, "Bring back Caesar," the way a child might ask for a father who hasn't come home from work. The conspirators had expected to be called liberators. By nightfall, they were being called something closer to butchers. And in the torchlit rooms where they gathered to reassure each other, some of them, not all, but some, began to understand that they had not restored the Republic. They had detonated it. In the house on the Palatine, the doors were barred. Lamps burned through the night. Calpurnia refused to leave his side. She sat in a low chair beside the table where his body lay, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on him as if watching for movement she already knew would not come. From time to time she reached out and touched his arm, not to wake him, but to keep herself anchored to the present. Outside the windows, Rome flickered. Footsteps, shouts in the distance, the clatter of hooves, the call and response of patrols. Inside, time stopped. There's a specific kind of quiet after someone like Caesar dies. It isn't peace, it's pressure. It feels like the room is holding its breath because the world is rebalancing around the empty space. Even she could feel it. Somewhere deep down, beneath the grief, beneath the shock, she understood the thing nobody else in Rome wanted to say out loud yet. This wasn't the end of danger. It was the beginning. The morning of the funeral arrived heavy with clouds. Rome felt smaller that day, as though the sky itself had lowered to watch. Every street leading to the Forum was filled long before noon. Citizens pressed shoulder to shoulder, veterans in worn armor, women clutching sprigs of laurel, children perched on steps and rooftops. No one had organized them. They had simply come. The conspirators had fled to the Capitoline Hill, unsure whether to appear or to stay hidden. Mark Antony had arranged the ceremony himself. He refused to let Caesar's memory vanish quietly into protocol. He wanted Rome to see. He wanted them to feel the absence. At the center of the Forum stood the bier, a wooden platform draped in purple, garlanded with myrtle and rosemary. Upon it lay Caesar's body, cloaked in red. His laurel wreath was carefully on his head. The scent of burning incense hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of rain on stone. As the procession began, the musicians played slowly, flutes and lyres weaving a rhythm too measured to be called melody. The sound drifted upward, echoing off marble walls and colonnades, until it seemed the city itself was breathing in time with the music. Antony stepped forward in his general's cloak. He was not calm, but contained, a man holding back a storm until the right moment. Behind him walked Octavian, the young heir, his face pale and unreadable, his hands clasped in front of him as if already praying. Antony raised his arm for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried not by volume, but by control. Each word struck the air like a steady drumbeat. "Citizens of Rome," he began, "you see before you the body of your friend, your leader, your father. You see what is left when envy claims courage as its excuse." He paused. No one moved. Even the rain seemed to stop for a moment. He told them of Caesar's generosity, how he had forgiven enemies, how he had rebuilt the city, how he had refused the crown when it was offered. He spoke of the colonies he planned to found, of the veterans he had promised to settle, of the peace he had nearly secured for every Roman alive. And then quietly he said, "Brutus calls him ambitious, but was it my ambition to feed the hungry, to heal the city's wounds, to forgive those who now hide behind marble walls?" The crowd stirred. Whispers spread like wind through wheat. Antony let the silence swell, then stepped closer to the bier. He gestured to the body, to the pale hands folded across the chest, to the torn cloak, to the wounds visible even beneath the linen. "If any of you loved him," he said, "look here, not at what he ruled, but at what was done to him." He lifted the cloak, slowly, deliberately, revealing the gashes beneath. 23. The air left the crowd in a single collective breath. "This," Antony said softly, "is how Rome rewards mercy." It began with one voice, a woman's cry from somewhere near the front, then another, then dozens, until the Forum was filled with the sound of grief breaking open. Men shouted Caesar's name, women tore at their veils, old soldiers wept openly, their faces streaked with ash. Antony stood unmoving, watching as emotion spread like fire through dry fields. He had not called for violence. He had not needed to. Grief is a weapon sharper than anger. Someone shouted, "Burn him here!" and others echoed it. "Here in the Forum! Let Rome be his pyre!" Antony gave no order, but neither did he forbid it. Wood was fetched from nearby shops, benches torn apart, torches passed from hand to hand. As the sky darkened, flames rose from the bier. Smoke coiled upward, carrying with it the scent of cedar and resin. The crowd watched, silent now, faces lit orange by the growing fire. Someone tossed a soldier's cloak into the flames. Then a veteran laid down his helmet. Then a woman cast her child's wreath of flowers. One by one, offerings fell into the blaze until the fire glowed like a new sun in the heart of the city. Antony stood at the edge of the platform, the heat brushing against his face. He spoke only once more, barely above a whisper. He was Rome. The words were simple, but in them lay everything: devotion, regret, prophecy. When the fire burned low, the people began to chant. Not in unison, not with rhythm, but with the raw, uncertain sound of mourning too wide for language. "Caesar! Caesar!" The name rolled through the Forum like thunder without rain. By nightfall, the chants had become shouts. The crowd surged through the streets, grabbing torches from the pyre. They tore down the homes of the conspirators, dragged statues into the open, threw debris into the flames. Panic spread through the city like wind through dry leaves. Antony had expected fury, but not this. Not the way the people seemed possessed by something ancient and unstoppable. He climbed the steps of the rostrum, calling for calm, his voice nearly lost beneath the roar. "Citizens, remember Rome," he cried. "Do not destroy what he built." But grief, once unchained, does not reason. The crowd pressed forward, faces lit by torchlight, and for a moment Antony saw in them the very chaos Caesar had feared most. He descended quietly, letting the storm pass around him. In the smoke and shouting, he saw young Octavian watching from the edge of the square, still, composed, eyes burning with something between terror and understanding. They did not speak, but Antony nodded once. The boy nodded back. Something had shifted. Power, like smoke, was already finding a new shape. By morning, the flames had burned down to ash. The forum was blackened, its marble cracked from the heat. A fine layer of soot drifted across the city like snow. People moved softly through the streets, voices hushed, as though afraid to wake something that had fallen asleep beneath the embers. Calpurnia came at dawn to collect what was left, the urn of ashes, the laurel, a handful of charred wood. She placed them in a small cart, and with only a few servants beside her, carried him home one last time. As she passed the streets, the people bowed their heads. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to still be in respect. In the distance, the first light touched the rooftops, turning the soot to silver. And somewhere a boy's voice echoed faintly through the streets, soft, uncertain, but carrying, "Caesar, Caesar." The forum was still warm in places where the pyre had burned through the night. Thin threads of smoke rose from cracked marble, and the air held that strange smell that always follows fire, a mix of ash, resin, and something almost sweet. Rome felt bruised. People walked carefully through the square, as if stepping across a grave. Where the bier had stood, there was now only a wide circle of blackened stone. In the center, someone had already placed flowers, coins, and little clay figures. A woman from Subura laid down a slice of bread for him, the way you might leave food for a household spirit. A veteran from the 10th Legion knelt, touched 2 fingers to the burned stone, and pressed those same fingers to his forehead, then to his lips. No one had planned any of it. Grief had simply arranged itself. The conspirators had not expected this. They had imagined that, by killing Caesar, everything would return to normal. The Senate would resume its authority, the consuls would rule, the people would go back to being governed, not inspired. Instead, something else had happened, something they had not prepared for, perhaps could not have prepared for. The people did not want a Senate. The people wanted Caesar back. Rome is not a quiet city. Even at its calmest, even at dawn, it buzzes. Carts, traders, gossip, wheels, pigeons, sandals on stone. But on the day after the funeral, the usual noise had a different tone. People were not calling to sell olives or shouting for laborers. They were telling each other the story of what had happened, retelling it, reshaping it, fixing it into something that would live. "He held out his hands and begged them for mercy," one woman said, eyes wide. "No," another whispered. "He didn't beg. He covered his face with his cloak so they wouldn't see his expression. They stabbed him in the back, all of them at once. It was Brutus who finished it. Brutus, his favorite." Much of this was wrong, or only half right, or retold through emotion instead of detail. But accuracy is never the point in moments like this. You can feel a city deciding what is true and sealing it in place. Truth hardens faster than marble. By midday, the version carried in the streets was simple and deadly. He was gentle. They were cruel. That story alone was enough to tilt the balance of Rome. Mark Antony understood that. He had gone home near dawn, slept in his clothes for perhaps an hour, and then rose and began working. He sent messengers through every district. He spoke with captains of the watch. He took control of both the grain supply and the city guard in the same morning. He did it smoothly, with almost no resistance, because everyone already looked to him anyway. He made no declaration that he now led Rome. He didn't need to. He just behaved as if Rome were already leaning on his hand, which in a way it was. When officials came to ask whether the Senate would meet, he answered, "In time." When lenders and taxmen came to ask about repayments and arrears, he answered, "Caesar had plans for that. I will honor them." When a delegation of frightened senators quietly asked if he would protect them if the crowd turned violent, he looked at them for a long moment and said, "I will protect Rome," which was not, strictly speaking, the same promise. And then there was Octavian. He was not yet the man history would later know. He was still young, still pale, still composed in that unsettling way that makes you realize composure is sometimes a form of appetite. But even now, even this early, people were beginning to notice him. They could not name the feeling, but they felt it. When he entered a room, the air adjusted. He spent the morning of the day after the funeral not in public, not making speeches, not trying to command attention. He spent it quietly at Caesar's house. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking at the urn of ashes on the table. He did not cry. He did not speak to the servants, not at first. He looked like someone memorizing a moment for later use. One of Caesar's household staff approached him cautiously and said, "He loved you." Octavian turned his head, very slightly. "He prepared me," he said. "Prepared me. Not raised me, not favored me. Prepared me." That word hung in the air like a drawn blade. By early afternoon, Rome had already split itself in two, though no one admitted it out loud. On one side were the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, the senators who had driven in the knives. They barricaded themselves in safe houses and on the Capitoline Hill. They sent messages out, frantic but dignified in tone, declaring that they had acted for liberty, for tradition, for the ancestral laws of the Republic. They tried to reach allies. They tried to count allies. On the other side were Antony and those aligned with him, which increasingly meant everyone who was afraid of chaos. Not loyal to Antony, necessarily, loyal to the idea of continued functioning. Shopkeepers, transport guilds, dock workers, legion veterans, people who had rent due and children to feed, people for whom philosophy meant nothing and stability meant everything. Here is the cruel truth the conspirators had missed. The republic they wanted to restore no longer existed in the minds of the people who actually lived in Rome. It still existed in speeches. It still existed in marble. It still existed in the oaths senators gave each other in darkened rooms. But it was already gone in practice. They hadn't restored anything. They had created a vacancy. Brutus felt that shift. He could almost taste it in the air. He had always believed himself to be a moral man. He had not killed Caesar for wealth or jealousy. He had not lifted a dagger for personal advancement. He had done it, in his own mind, to save the state. Now, standing at the edge of the Capitoline, looking down at the smoke rising from the Forum, he began to feel something he had not expected. Doubt. No regret. Not yet. But I doubt it. He could hear the crowds from here. He could make out only fragments of words: father, justice, burn them, betrayal. None of those fragments sounded like gratitude. Cassius urged him to act. "We must send word to the legions," Cassius said. "We must secure the treasury. We must make a statement now, while Antony is still gathering his strength." But Brutus hesitated. He wanted to believe that the people only needed to hear the explanation. He wanted to believe that Romans would understand that the dagger he had lifted was not lifted against Rome, but for Rome. He had not yet understood the thing Antony already knew. You cannot talk people out of grief. At sunset, Calpurnia finally allowed the household to move Caesar's ashes to a safer room, away from the front reception hall. She agreed only because the house had started to draw crowds, people clustering outside just to stand near the wall, just to say, "This is where he is." She walked beside the urn as it was carried. Her hands never left it. She seemed calm, but there was a fixedness in her gaze, the look of someone who has not slept and has no plans to. In a soft voice, she gave instructions for offerings. She wanted lamps lit. She wanted fresh flowers every morning. She wanted guards at the door not to keep people out, but to keep the curious gentle. "Respect," she kept saying. "Respect." There is a strange moment always when the private grief of a family becomes the public grief of a state. It's when a person stops being a person and becomes a relic. That line was already being crossed. As evening drew down, the city felt tight, coiled. Torches burned along the main streets, throwing long, unsteady shadows across stone. Priests whispered that the gods were unsettled. Tavern keepers whispered that there would be fighting before morning. Mothers told their sons to stay inside. Young men did not listen. You could feel it. The mood had shifted from sorrow to readiness. Somewhere in the dark, men sharpened knives and told each other they were defending Rome. Elsewhere in the dark, other men counted coins and told each other they were defending Rome. In truth, everyone was defending something different and calling it Rome. Near twilight, Antony returned to the Forum. The blackened circle where Caesar's body had burned was still warm underfoot. People gathered around him the moment he appeared. Hands reached out, not for alms, not for grain, but for clarity. "What happens now?" someone called. He let the question hang there. He understood how valuable silence is before an answer. Then, evenly, he said, "Now we make sure those who loved him are protected, and those who murdered him are contained. There will be no purges. There will be no burning of houses. There will be law." The crowd murmured, a low, hopeful sound. Antony nodded once, slowly, like a man making an oath to something larger than himself. "Rome," he said, "still has a hand on the reins." That line spread through the streets before full dark. People said, "He has it under control. He said there will be a law. He said no purges." And in that way, Antony bought himself exactly what he needed most: time. Later, in the dim quiet of Caesar's house, Octavian sat alone with a small oil lamp and a list. It was not a dramatic list. It contained no battle plans, no threats. It contained names. Names of commanders loyal to Caesar in the provinces, names of treasurers, names of men who owed favors, names of legions. He ran his fingertip down that list like someone tracing a map. He did not yet have an army. He did not yet have public authority. He did not yet have the city. But he had Caesar's name, Caesar's will, and Caesar's promise. And he had patience. He whispered, barely audible, as if testing how the words felt in his own mouth, "I am his heir." Not boastful, just factual. The lamp flickered. Outside, Rome shifted in its sleep. Something new had entered the world, and the world had not noticed yet. Power doesn't fall, it transfers. Not always cleanly, not always willingly, but it always moves. And in the days after Caesar's death, you could watch it moving through Rome like a current. It flowed first toward Mark Antony. It flowed almost invisibly toward Octavian, and the city became the space between them. Antony had the obvious advantages. He had age. He had a presence. He had military credibility. Not Caesar's genius, but long service and proven loyalty in war. He had the consulship, which gave him legal authority to speak for the state. And most of all, in the hours after the assassination, he did what no one else did. He acted. While Brutus argued philosophy and Cassius calculated escape routes and the Senate drafted statements about liberty, Antony did practical things. He secured Caesar's papers. He secured Caesar's treasury. He secured the loyalty of Caesar's bodyguards and veteran officers in the city. That alone was everything. Men who had followed Caesar in Gaul would not take orders from Brutus. They didn't know Brutus. They didn't love him. They respected his name, but names don't feed families. Those same men would follow Antony. Not because he inspired them the way Caesar had. He didn't. But because he spoke the language they understood. Stipends, land grants, protection for widows. He was an officer, not a dream. In the first few days, you could feel Rome silently leaning toward him out of instinct. If anyone was going to step forward and stop the city from tearing itself apart before the week was over, that person had to be Antony. And Antony knew it. But Antony also knew something else. He knew that fear, once it's tasted blood, does not simply go back to sleep. The Senate watched him with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because if Antony stayed calm, the city stayed calm. Terror because if Antony chose anger, no set of laws, no old speeches, no memory of how things used to be, could protect them. They offered him a compromise. They said, "Let's do this quietly. We will not punish the conspirators immediately. We will not start a war over one death, even his death. We will declare an amnesty for Brutus, Cassius, and the rest. And in exchange, Antony, you make sure the people don't rip them apart in the streets. You promise safety for them, and we promise position for you." It was a clever offer. It sounded like peace. What it actually meant was, help us survive. Antony, always careful when it mattered, agreed, in public. He told the Senate he supported stability. He said Rome could not afford more blood. He said Caesar himself would have wanted order. And for a moment it worked. The conspirators breathed again. The senators congratulated themselves for restoring reason. But Antony's agreement was not to surrender. It was delayed. Because while they were congratulating themselves for saving the Republic, and while the city still smelled like smoke from the funeral pyre, Antony quietly did something else. He began claiming Caesar's authority as if it were already his. Caesar left behind something more powerful than any speech: paperwork. He had planned appointments to offices that were not yet filled. He had drafted decrees that were not yet proclaimed. He had promised gifts, citizenship grants, land distributions. In life, those were plans. In death, they became leverage. Antony took possession of those documents. He told Rome that the dead dictator's wishes would be carried out, that Caesar's policies would continue, uninterrupted, as if Caesar still breathed. He said he would stand as executor and protector of Caesar's acts. It was a beautiful move, because it sounded like loyalty to Caesar. And it was, in a way, but it was also a way of saying, I now decide what Caesar wanted. He didn't say, I rule Rome. He said, I am merely carrying out Caesar's instructions on Rome, which, in practice, is the same thing. The Senate understood too late what that meant. By allowing Antony to honor Caesar's plans, they had allowed him to wield Caesar's unfinished power without calling it rule. Then, quietly, a new complication appeared. Octavian arrived. When Gaius Octavius, soon to be called Octavian, entered Rome after Caesar's death, not everyone noticed. He wasn't marching with legions. He wasn't wrapped in a general's cloak. He didn't storm into the forum demanding loyalty. He moved like a shadow, not a trumpet. He came in with a small escort, paid his respects to Calpurnia and the household, and asked, in a controlled voice, to see the will. Caesar's will. Antony had it. This was a problem, because the will wasn't just a legal document. It was a message from beyond the grave. It spoke with the one voice Rome still trusted. And if that voice had chosen an heir, if it had named someone not just as beneficiary but as son, then Antony's hold, which he had just spent days building, could crack. Antony knew all of this the moment he saw Octavian. He also underestimated him. He saw a thin, serious teenager with careful posture and thought, not a threat. That was, and would remain, one of Antony's great mistakes. When the will was finally made known, it fell over Rome like a second funeral. Caesar had adopted Octavian as his son, not symbolically, legally. In Roman terms, that mattered more than blood. Adoption in Rome wasn't sentimental, it was a success. It meant, this one inherits not just my property, but my role. He left money to the Roman people, a direct gift, a final embrace. He left gardens and estates for public use, and he was named Octavian heir. That last part changed everything. You could feel the air shift. Up until that moment, Antony could claim to be the guardian of Caesar's memory. Now, standing in the same city, was someone who could claim to be Caesar's continuation. And not just claim it, prove it. From that moment, Octavian began referring to himself with a new form of his name, Gaius Julius Caesar. That was not ego, that was branding. Imagine the effect of that in the street. A man steps forward and says, I'm Caesar's son, not by rumor, by law, by his own hand. In a city that speaks in loyalty and memory, that sentence is its own army. Antony's first instinct was to pull Octavian close. Stay near me, he said. Let us act together. Your father loved me. I loved him. We will carry him forward. We will settle this city, and then, together, we will punish those who betrayed him. On the surface, it was an offer of alliance. Underneath, it was containment. If Octavian stayed beside him, Antony could manage him, present him to the crowds when useful, keep him hidden when not, and most importantly, keep him from forming his own network of loyalty. He planned to be the sword and let Octavian, if necessary, be the symbol. A perfect arrangement for Antony. Octavian nodded. He did not argue. He did not object. He said everything Antony wanted to hear. And then, quietly, politely, he did not obey. Where Antony moved through Rome like force, Octavian moved through Rome like water. He visited the veterans, not publicly, in small groups, in private courtyards, in quiet houses off the main streets where no one thought to look. He didn't promise them glory. He promised them fulfillment of Caesar's promises, land payment, honor kept. He said it in a calm, almost gentle voice like someone discussing household accounts, not rousing, not theatrical. But every word landed, because veterans lived in fear that Caesar's death meant their settlements and grants would vanish. Octavian told them, "No, I will see you honored," as he swore. Then he sent letters to provincial commanders who had served under Caesar. Not angry letters, not "rise for me," measured letters. I am his son. I intend to defend what he built. I will remember who stands with me. He did something else too, something almost invisible but devastating. He spoke to creditors. Caesar had left money. Caesar had also left debts and obligations. Antony was in the process of absorbing control of those resources. Octavian began quietly to raise funds in his own name to pay Caesar's bequests to the public. That seems like a technical detail. It wasn't. It meant that when ordinary Romans received coins from Caesar, it wasn't Antony's face they associated with that gift. It was Octavian's. He wasn't just claiming emotional inheritance. He was claiming financial inheritance. And in Rome, that mattered. Antony thought Octavian was a boy. Brave, yes. Clever, maybe. Useful, certainly. He did not yet understand that Octavian's patience was not softness. It was a blade laid flat. Octavian, meanwhile, understood Antony perfectly. He knew Antony had the crowds, for now. He knew Antony had the Senate frightened, for now. He knew Antony had soldiers in the city, for now. But he also knew something deeper. Antony was louder than he was disciplined. Antony burned hot. Antony filled space. Men who burn hot, Octavian understood, leave edges exposed. So Octavian began to work along the edges. He courted men Antony took for granted. He wrote to people that Antony was too busy to notice. He studied every move Antony made, not to stop it in the moment, but to learn what sort of man he would one day have to break. He never said this aloud. He didn't need to. He was already thinking in years, not days. By the end of that first week, the situation looked, from the outside, stable. The city was not burning. The conspirators were still alive, though isolated. The Senate was pretending it still mattered. Antony was acting like the natural successor. Octavian was being polite. If you looked at it quickly, you might have thought the danger had passed. But if you stood in the forum at dusk and just listened, not to shouting but to tone, you could hear the truth under everything. This was not a resolution. This was positioning. The fire had not burned out. It had only split into two slow, controlled flames. One wore Antony's face. The other, not yet fully visible, wore Caesar's name. Rome did not collapse in a day. It simply stopped believing in itself. The Senate still met, still recited its prayers to the old gods, still recorded decrees on wax tablets. But those decrees were now read in rooms where no one listened. They were stamped and sealed out of habit, not conviction. Men came to the Curia dressed in their white togas, but their eyes were always turned toward the streets, toward the noise outside, toward the shadow of soldiers moving in the distance. It was not rebellion that killed the Republic. It was irrelevant. At first, the Senate tried to act as if authority still lived within its walls. It passed resolutions. It declared holidays in Caesar's honor. It debated whether Brutus and Cassius should face trial or exile. But every decision was either too late or ignored. When they voted to confiscate Caesar's estates, Antony had already taken control of them. When they voted to calm the crowds had already chosen their calm elsewhere, in the hands of whoever could feed them. They debated legal definitions of dictator, argued whether Caesar's appointment as perpetual ruler had technically expired upon death. It was as if they were discussing the ownership of a house already on fire. Even those who had helped plan the assassination began to sense the absurdity. Brutus sat in the chamber one afternoon, listening to the endless drone of procedure, and whispered to Cassius, "We have restored the form, but not the spirit." Cassius answered without looking up, "The form is all that's left." While the Senate dissolved into its own echo, Antony moved outward. He met with the commanders of legions stationed near Rome. He met with provincial governors, promising continuity. He spoke with the people in the forum again, not as an orator, but as a caretaker. He told them, "Caesar's work continues. You are safe. Rome will remain strong." The crowd cheered because they wanted to believe it. They wanted someone to sound certain. Antony's certainty was his weapon. He issued new coins bearing Caesar's face, but with his own name stamped beneath it. The message was subtle, deliberate. I am his voice now. And the city accepted it. For a time. But Antony, for all his charisma, had two weaknesses. He trusted his instincts more than plans, and he drank too deeply from admiration. Both would matter soon. Octavian stayed quiet. He watched the Senate praise Antony, watched soldiers follow Antony, watched the crowd chant Antony's name in the same breath as Caesar's, and said nothing. He lived modestly, visited the forum rarely, and met people one by one, not in public but in private. He wrote letters at night by lamplight, each sealed with Caesar's old signet. He was learning the art of momentum, the way power looks like patience until it moves all at once. When he did speak, it was only to remind people of a single truth. I am Caesar's son. No elaboration, no embellishment. He let others do the explaining. In Rome, repetition becomes reality. And every time someone said his name, every time a soldier told another that Caesar's heir had greeted him, the sentence carried the weight of prophecy. He began gathering his own veterans, quietly, respectfully. He paid them personally, from loans and gifts and Caesar's bequests. The coins were stamped not with Antony's name, but with Caesar's, and by extension, his own. When they took the coins, they swore an oath, not to Antony, not to the Senate, but to Caesar. That meant Octavian. By late spring, Brutus and Cassius understood they could not stay. Every day brought new graffiti on the walls. Brutus, murderer. Caesar lives with his son. Justice for the fallen. Crowds had followed them through the streets shouting curses. Friends had stopped opening their doors. The word liberator had turned sour in every mouth that said it. They decided to leave the city under the pretext of taking new commands in the provinces. They hoped to raise legions quietly, far from Rome's chaos, to wait until the storm of emotion settled. But leaving Rome meant something larger than retreat. It meant absence. And absence in politics is a kind of death. As they rode out through the gates, the people barely watched. There were no stones thrown, no cheers, no farewells. Only indifference, the cruelest verdict of all. Rome itself began to change. Temples were still crowded, but the prayers had shifted from thanksgiving to pleading. Merchants hung small busts of Caesar over their stalls, half devotional, half advertisement. Street performers told stories of his victories. Children wore clay charms shaped like his laurel. Rome had turned its memory into an economy. Everywhere you looked, his image watched. On walls, on banners, on coins passed from hand to hand. He had become the ghost no one wanted to banish. And every time someone whispered his name, they thought less of the man and more of what had vanished with him. The sense of order, the predictability, the rhythm of a world that had briefly made sense. In early summer, the Senate tried one final act of relevance. They summoned both Antony and Octavian to appear before them. They wanted to mediate, to bind the two men together before rivalry turned to war. They spoke of unity, of shared duty, of the need to protect Caesar's reforms from chaos. Antony came late, dressed in a military cloak rather than senatorial white. He sat with arms folded, listening with the distant patience of someone waiting for the rain to stop. Octavian arrived quietly, without escort, and stood instead of sitting, a gesture of deference that also looked like control. The debate was polite at first, but beneath the words, everyone in the chamber could feel it. The center had already split. Rome now had two hearts beating out of rhythm. One man had the power of presence. The other had the power of inevitability. The session ended with formalities, with thanks and vows and gestures toward peace. But peace was now just a word people used to delay honesty. A few days later, Antony staged a military parade. Not an official triumph, but close enough to look like one. His soldiers marched through the streets, banners raised, drums slow and heavy. He rode at the front, his armor polished, the sunlight striking off the metal like fire. The crowd cheered. Women threw flowers, children shouted his name, but not all of them. Here and there, voices called another name, Caesar, Octavian. It was quiet at first, but Antony heard it. He turned sharply, scanning the crowd. That night, he drank heavily and raged at his aides. They cheer for a boy because he says a name, he said. He has done nothing. But even he knew the truth. Names move faster than achievements. If you had stood in the forum that summer, you would have seen nothing unusual. Merchants arguing, priests chanting, children playing. Life went on. The world looked intact. But beneath that surface, every institution that had once held Rome together was now just a habit. The Senate still met, but its voice no longer carried. Elections still happened, but they no longer decided power. Laws were still written, but only to justify decisions made elsewhere. Everything still looked Roman. Nothing still was. And perhaps that is the most Roman way to end, not in destruction, but in perfection so rigid it cannot move anymore. By the year's end, the Republic was not overthrown. It simply stopped breathing. One evening, Octavian walked alone through the Forum. The torches burned low. The marble still glowed faintly with the heat of the day. He stopped where the pyre had once stood, and for a moment he closed his eyes. He imagined Caesar standing there again, hands clasped behind his back, looking over the city that had both crowned and killed him. He whispered, "You built an empire without meaning to. I will make it deliberate." When he opened his eyes again, the Forum was empty, but in his mind he could already see the outlines of what would come. Columns, arches, armies, a world remade in marble and will, and the air, though still warm, seemed to carry the faintest chill, the breath of a new order drawing itself in. In the months after the Senate's final debates faded into ritual, Rome began to sound different. The clatter of hammers returned to the workshops, the markets reopened, ships filled the Tiber again. To the casual eye, the city had recovered, but recovery is not the same as return. Something had shifted forever. Everywhere, the word Caesar had become more than a name. It was a title, a symbol, a memory too convenient to release. Coins still bore his face, but now the face belonged to others. First Antony, then Octavian, then to whomever controlled the idea of order. In Rome, images have always meant more than men. It was through images that the Republic became myth, and myth became governance. At first, people called Octavian Caesar's son only out of politeness. Then they began saying it with conviction. Then, without noticing, they dropped the possessive entirely and called him simply Caesar. A word had absorbed a man. When Antony and Octavian finally met again, it was not in open battle, but in calculation. Both needed time, both needed legitimacy, and both knew that the conspirators, now commanding legions in the east, were the immediate threat. So, with the cool precision of men too exhausted for idealism, they formed an agreement. A triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. 3 names joined for convenience, 3 edges of a single blade. They announced it to the Senate as an act of national healing. In truth, it was an act of division formalized. Together they raised armies to chase Brutus and Cassius. They promised revenge in the name of justice, justice in the name of peace, and peace in the name of Rome. The Senate, relieved to have someone, anyone, speaking in sentences that sounded like order, ratified everything without question. Soon after, proscriptions began. Lists, names, property seized, enemies hunted, debts forgiven or repaid according to usefulness. The Republic's final vocabulary. Men who had once debated philosophy now read the lists at dawn to see if they still existed. And through it all, Octavian spoke softly, rarely. He let Antony play the public soldier, the visible force, the noise. Octavian became the silence beneath it, the calm voice drafting orders, the measured hand signing decrees. He was learning what Caesar had known only too late, that to rule forever, one must never look like a ruler. In the autumn of the following year, the armies of Brutus and Cassius met the legions of Antony and Octavian in the plains near Philippi. The wind there smelled of pine and dust, and the ghosts of the old Republic gathered invisibly along the ridges to watch. The battle lasted 2 days. On the first, Brutus held the advantage. On the second, Cassius fell upon his own sword, mistaking smoke for defeat. By the time the sun set on the second evening, the cause of liberty, whatever it had meant, lay silent in the dust. Brutus died not far from the river, whispering that he had loved virtue too much to live among the living. His body was burned with respect, even by his enemies, for Rome always honored courage, even when misplaced. When news of the victory reached the city, bells rang, torches blazed, and the crowd shouted Caesar's name. Not Octavian's, not Antony's, but Caesar's. Because in their minds, this was still his war. He had been avenged. History had finished the gesture he had begun. For a brief, deceptive year, Antony and Octavian ruled as partners. Their portraits appeared side by side on coins. Their decrees carried both signatures. They spoke in the same sentences, shared the same praise, pretended the same friendship. But power, like gravity, does not divide well. Antony had the East, the wealth of Egypt, the grain of Syria, the trade of the Nile. Octavian held the West, the legions in Italy, the Senate, the heart of Rome. Distance turned alliance into rivalry. Letters arrived slower. Rumors traveled faster. When Antony met Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, the alliance began to dissolve, not in battle, but in perception. Rome could forgive cruelty. pride, even tyranny. But it never forgave the sense that its leaders were dreaming elsewhere. Whispers spread that Antony had gone soft in the perfumed courts of Alexandria, that he wore Eastern robes, that he called himself a god beside a foreign queen. Some of it was true. Much of it was invention. All of it was useful to Octavian. He didn't shout the rumors. He simply let them breathe. And Rome did the rest. The final war of the Republic began without a declaration. It began in tone, in the Senate speeches Octavian had written for others, in the subtle phrasing of decrees that praised Roman virtue while condemning foreign corruption. When he finally moved his fleets toward Greece, he told the people it was not against Antony he sailed, but against Cleopatra. It was not civil war, it was purification. Rome loves purity as long as someone else pays for it. The fleets met off Actium under a haze of heat and salt. Antony's ships were larger, heavier, more beautiful, floating palaces of cedar and gold. Octavian's were lighter, faster, built for precision rather than spectacle. When the wind shifted that afternoon, so did history. Cleopatra's fleet broke first, Antony followed, and Octavian's captains pressed the advantage. By nightfall, the sea itself seemed to burn, a mirror of flame stretching from shore to horizon. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where within a year they chose their own end. In Rome, the news was received not with shock, but with relief. The noise had stopped. The world could exhale again. When Octavian returned to Rome, he was only 33, younger than Caesar had been when he first commanded legions. Yet in his face there was none of youth's lightness left. The Senate, eager to preserve ceremony even in surrender, offered him titles: Princeps, Augustus, Father of the Nation. He accepted them all with a kind of detached grace, as if pretending they had come to him reluctantly. He closed the doors of Janus's temple, signifying peace throughout the empire, the first time in living memory that those doors had shut. The streets filled with music again, the taverns reopened, the forges rang. Rome looked, for the first time in years, content. But beneath that calm was design. Every governor now owed office to him. Every general owed loyalty to him. Every law passed only with his nod. The Republic was still there in name, its assemblies, its elections, its rituals, but they were echoes now, hollow as seashells. And in the silence of that echo, Octavian became something new. Not king, not a dictator, something quieter, more permanent, the principle around which everything else revolved. He rebuilt temples, restored aqueducts, commissioned poets to write of peace, sculptors to carve victory in marble. He gave the world an illusion so convincing that even historians would one day call it order. The empire did not begin with fanfare. It began with routine, decrees, census records, births and deaths written neatly on wax tablets. That is how revolutions survive, not in fire, but in paperwork. From Spain to Syria, the roads Caesar had imagined were now crowded with messengers, grain merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers wearing the same uniform, marching to the same rhythm, under the same sun. Rome had become not a city, but a pattern of behavior, and in that pattern, one name endured. Every ruler who followed would take it, every language would reshape it. In time it would become a word for power itself: Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar. Sometimes in the palace he had built on the Palatine, Augustus, the name Octavian now carried, would walk alone at night, as Caesar once had. He would pause by the balcony overlooking the city, watching the lamps flicker far below. He would listen to the faint hum of prayers rising from the streets, and feel the same chill of awareness. That peace, too, is a kind of conquest. He had made the world still. But stillness, like silence, has weight. He thought often of the man who had started it all, the uncle, the adoptive father, the restless mind that had seen order as an art form. He wondered whether Caesar would have recognized this Rome, or whether he would have seen it as proof of his own warning, that control, once total, can only grow outward. Sometimes when dawn touched the rooftops, he would whisper the old name under his breath, not as prayer, not as pride, but as a reminder: Caesar. And in the cool light, it sounded less like a word and more like an echo of the sea, endless, inevitable, carving stone by patience alone. Centuries later, travelers would stand among the ruins of the Forum, listening to guides speak his name. The stones would still bear the marks of chariot wheels. The marble would still remember the heat of old fires. They would say, "Here he spoke, here he fell, Here Rome learned to live forever by pretending to die, and above it all, the wind would move through broken columns with a sound like breath, like whisper, like memories. If you closed your eyes, you could almost hear it say, "Nothing truly ends, it only changes form." The Republic had become an empire. The empire would become a memory, and memory, calm, unhurried, repeating itself like waves against the shore, would outlast them all. The noise of battle faded, and in its absence, something larger began. Rome had conquered the world. Now it had to learn how to live with it. Octavian, now Augustus, understood that victory was only half a story. The other half was memory. He turned soldiers into builders. He filled empty fields with temples. He wrapped the raw edges of the empire in marble and ceremony until power looked like peace. He told the Senate they were free again, and they believed him, because he allowed them to keep their chairs and their titles, and that was all most men truly wanted, to be seen sitting in importance, even if the room no longer listened. He restored festivals that had vanished in the wars. He revived old rituals, not because he believed in the gods more deeply than others, but because he believed in habit. Habit is faith's quieter twin. It keeps people moving even when conviction runs thin. Rome, under his calm direction, began to glow again. New aqueducts spanned the hills. Fresh roads ran out from the city like veins. Markets filled with goods from Africa, spices from the east, glass from Alexandria. To live in Rome now was to feel the future underfoot. But beneath that brilliance was control so gentle it felt like a choice. Every coin bore his face. Every temple inscription carried his name. Every festival honored him by implication. It was not tyranny, it was choreography. He had learned from Caesar's wounds that power declared is power threatened, power absorbed is eternal. And so Augustus smiled, blessed the Republic, and ruled unopposed for 40 years. It was not just Rome he rebuilt. He rebuilt the idea of being Roman. In Gaul, children learned Latin songs. In Spain, farmers paid taxes in Roman coins and swore by Roman law. In the deserts of Syria, merchants sealed deals under Roman contracts. The empire became a mirror that reflected the city into every horizon. And always, above that reflection, there was the quiet echo of Caesar, not the man, but the momentum. Every province governed itself because it was easier that way. Yet all roads, all accounts, all letters still led back to Rome. That was the brilliance of it, a center that did not move, drawing all motion toward itself. As the years passed, the city grew used to calm. Children born after Actium could not remember the Civil War. They thought peace was the natural state of things. They thought Augustus had always been there. He encouraged this illusion. He wanted Rome to think of time itself as wearing his face. He gathered poets to give shape to that feeling. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, names that still echo when marble is dust. They wrote of gods and destinies, of shepherds finding paradise within duty, of love bound to order. They gave the empire its conscience. Virgil's Aeneid became its anthem, a story of a wanderer who found his destiny in obedience. It was not history, it was therapy. Rome needed to believe it had always been right. And in that beautiful fiction, the Republic's ghost was buried completely. Augustus never said this aloud. He didn't need to. He simply smiled at the poets, rewarded them with land, and allowed their verses to travel farther than any legion. Thus was the Golden Age forged, not by conquest but by consensus, by the gentle persuasion of art. In private, he aged like anyone else. He grew cautious of cold air, ate sparingly, slept less. He became quieter, as though each passing year peeled another layer of noise from the world. Sometimes he would walk among the statues in his gardens at night, touching the marble faces of long-dead friends, Agrippa, Maecenas, even Antony, and whisper their names under his breath like prayer beads. He did not love the statues. He loved the memory that still answered when he spoke. He had seen too much blood to romanticize immortality. He preferred the kind of permanence that looked like stone and sounded like silence. In his final years, Augustus spent more time by the sea. He said the salt air reminded him of campaigns long past, of ships on the Nile, of mornings when history still felt young. He wrote letters to the Senate, still pretending they ruled. He gave advice to his stepson Tiberius, still pretending power could be inherited without change. And one morning, near Nola, he fell asleep and did not wake. They say his last words were gentle. "I found Rome brick. I left it marble." It was true in every sense. The stones had changed, so had the people, so had the story. When the funeral procession wound through the city, it passed under arches he had built, past temples he had raised, through forums where poets had sung his virtues. The crowd wept, but not as they had for Caesar. There was no panic, no riot, only stillness. That was his final victory. He had made stability feel natural. Centuries later, emperors would claim descent from him. Each would wear the title Caesar as both honor and warning. Each would promise peace and deliver control. Each would find that Rome's greatest invention was not the legion or the law, but continuity. Even when the empire fractured, when barbarians crossed the frontiers, when the Senate vanished into memory, the idea endured. Every ruler since, every king, every nation that called itself civilized, borrowed some fragment of this Roman dream. Order through grandeur, peace through structure, identity through myth. If you stand in Rome today, the stones still breathe. The air still hums with voices you cannot quite make out. Not ghosts, just echoes. The sound of marble remembering sunlight. And if you listen long enough beneath the traffic, beneath the wind, you might still hear it. That quiet rhythm of footsteps in sandals, that murmur of Latin carried by dust. Not calling for empire, not for conquest, just for remembrance. Because history, in the end, isn't about victories or ruins. It's about presence, the persistence of what once mattered. And so, as the night deepens and the fires of old Rome fade into stars, we leave Julius Caesar and his heirs at peace, their story complete, their shadow is infinite. Sleep well, for even empires must rest. And so, from the ambitions of one man, a world was remade. Rome outlived its republic, outlasted its Caesars, and still stands, not as it was, but as it taught the world to imagine itself. Empires rise and fall, but ideas endure. Caesar's life was a storm, but his legacy became a still sea, one that would reflect every power that followed. As the lamps of ancient Rome fade into the hush of history, we're left with that quiet understanding. That greatness never truly ends, it simply changes form. If you've drifted this far with me tonight, thank you. Let the noise of the world fall away now, and rest knowing that even in ruin there is rhythm, and even in endings there is peace. Sleep well, and I'll see you again soon, in the next calm chapter of Rome's eternal story.